Before we move down into the mountain areas tonight, if you are liking this documentary, please press that hype button. It really assists this channel to expand in paths you might not fully see. The system loves engagement, and your backing means absolutely everything to us. Also, leave a remark letting us know what time it is, where you are located, and where in the world you are listening from. We completely love seeing our group of listeners reach across different time zones and far countries. There is no pressure at all. Only do it if you feel like sharing. Now, let us talk about what takes place when a doubting person goes searching for reality in the oldest mountains of America and stumbles upon something that was never intended to be found. Introduction. The man who went searching. Jacob Marin made his living by proving myths were wrong. For 6 years, he had journeyed from rumored haunted asylums to supposed extraterrestrial hotspots, carrying his camera, showing the truth behind every supernatural story that ended up on his desk. His documentary photo collection, Folklore Exposed, had gathered a big following among logical people and skeptics alike. He was very organized, scientific, and totally sure that every single unexplained event had a logical explanation waiting to be found. In September of 2021, Jacob made a public statement about his most daring project so far. He would travel through the Appalachian mountain corridor, that old backbone of stone that runs from Virginia all the way down into North Carolina, and systematically prove that a collection of conspiracy theories that had been growing on internet forums for decades were false. His target list was very long and unusual. Restricted communities hidden away in forgotten valleys. Groups of vanishing people that made no mathematical sense. The so-called not deer encounters that messed with the stories of hikers. Strange staircases found deep in the woods that led to absolutely nothing. The huge wave of disappearances near the Smoky Mountain area. And perhaps most interesting of all, whispers of secret government facilities hidden inside the endless woods. Jacob shared his plans across every single digital platform he could use. The response was instant and huge. Thousands of comments came pouring in. Some gave encouragement, many gave warnings, and a few gave clear threats. But it was a private, direct message that came 3 days after his statement that made him stop, if only for a brief moment. The sender's profile was completely blank, wiped of any personal information. The text itself was frighteningly simple. If you are going up into that area, stay away from the corridor between Rand Mountain and Klingman's Dome. That is the place where they watch. Jacob took a screenshot of the text, added it to his growing file of scary nonsense, and kept going with his planning. He had received hundreds of similar warnings over the years. They all followed the exact same design: unclear threats, eerie warnings, and never any real proof. He had learned to just ignore them. That choice, that single decision to look past the anonymous warning, would completely change the direction of his life in ways he could never have predicted. Part 1. The Recorded Reality. Jacob started his investigation the exact way he always did, by separating proven facts from exaggerated stories. Before he could prove the conspiracy theories wrong, he needed to understand what was actually true about the Appalachian wilderness. This research phase brought to light several undeniable facts that even the most doubting person could not argue against. The Appalachian Range, even though it is one of the most visited mountain networks in America, held massive areas of land that stayed deeply isolated. While not officially labeled as restricted or forbidden areas, certain locations had conditions that made them basically impossible to reach for regular hikers and even highly experienced woodsmen. Mobile phone signals stopped working completely in countless deep valleys and low hollows. Jacob put down in writing over 40 separate regions where communication technology simply failed to function at all, creating total blind spots in our otherwise connected world. Huge sections of land, some covering several square miles, rarely if ever saw any patrols by park rangers because of the very difficult landscape and the limited financial resources available. The official records blamed low funding and the need to focus on busy zones, but the outcome remained identical. Sections of the American wild existed in a state of almost total isolation. The cavern systems offered another proven mystery. Geological studies from the 1950s up to the 1970s had recorded massive underground networks all through the Appalachians. Yet, many of these systems stayed completely unmapped. The explanations offered were different each time. Unstable stone structures, hazardous underground streams, and the incredible size and detail of the tunnel paths. No matter the reason, huge parts of what lay under the mountains stayed officially unrecognized. Then there were the blocked-off mining projects. During the middle of the 20th century, mostly between the 1950s and 1970s, the federal government had shut down many mining tunnels all across the Appalachian chain. The official paperwork pointed to weak structures and environmental worries. Heavy iron gates were put in place, warning signs were attached, and the locations were basically left behind. Jacob discovered paperwork for dozens of these shutdowns, but the specific pattern is what caught his attention. Many had been blocked off all of a sudden, without the slow slowdown that usually happens when a mine runs out of materials. The data on missing individuals showed the most concerning verified facts. Local search and rescue groups kept files on disappearances that showed actual groupings. High numbers of missing people cases that went way past normal mathematical expectations. The National Park Service recognized these trends but blamed them on the natural dangers of outdoor activities. People lost their way, slipped from high rocks, or gave in to the harsh weather. The mountains did not forgive those who were not ready. Jacob gathered all of this verified data into one detailed report. These were the facts, the recorded truths that conspiracy believers used as the base for their most wild stories. He recorded himself showing this data, speaking in a calm and educational voice, explaining that even though these pieces were strange, they did not need supernatural or secret government stories to explain them. Far-off wilderness zones naturally caused communication blind spots. Low budgets naturally caused unpatrolled areas. Intricate cave systems naturally stayed unmapped because of danger and difficulty. Mining projects naturally shut down because of money and safety reasons, and individuals naturally went missing in huge, hazardous forests. It was all completely logical, completely clear, and completely sensible. He had no way of knowing how fast that confidence would wash away. Part 2. The Indigenous Perspective. Before going into the mountains, Jacob made sure to talk with the people who had known the land for the longest time. He had learned from his past research that indigenous viewpoints, though frequently ignored by main information sources, often held deeply important historical background that could explain where different myths and stories started. He set up a meeting with Thomas Whitehawk, a Cherokee historian and cultural preservation expert living in Cherokee, North Carolina. The talk happened in a tiny office filled with piles of books, regional maps, and old items. Thomas was a man in his 60s, speaking softly, but with eyes that hinted he had witnessed far more than he usually talked about. Jacob laid out his project, his plan to look into the conspiracy stories around the Appalachian path and give logical answers for the different points. Thomas listened without breaking in once, his face showing no emotion. When Jacob stopped talking, Thomas stayed silent for a very long time before he finally answered. The Cherokee possess tales regarding these ridges that stretch back further than your recorded history, Thomas started. There are territories our forebears stayed away from, not due to belief in old tales, but because of real knowledge handed down through generations. Jacob moved closer with his recording device, keen to write down what he believed would be helpful urban legend. Thomas kept speaking. We talked about woodland mimics, entities that were able to duplicate noises, human words, the look of creatures, or even individuals. We cautioned about inaccurate animals, beasts that seemed normal from far away but incorrect from a short distance. There were speech sounds that shouted from behind tree trunks, attempting to entice individuals away from secure walkways. And there lay the dirt between the peaks, a spot where the walls between dimensions became thin. These are symbolic stories, though, correct? Jacob interrupted. Methods of clarifying natural occurrences that your forebears lacked the technical terms to talk about. Thomas offered him a glance that was not exactly sympathy, but near to it. You are not the initial person to arrive here with recording lenses and doubt. Different individuals have made the identical trip or are preparing to, and a few returned altered. A few did not return at all, and a few returned but prefer they had stayed. Jacob smirked, believing he was being evaluated. I value the caution, but I am entering with an unbiased perspective and a systematic approach. If there is something truly unclarified up there, I will record it. But I have been performing this work for 6 years, and I have never run into anything that could not be clarified by human mind factors, weather and surroundings, or basic misidentification. Thomas stood up, indicating the conversation was over. As Jacob stored his gear, the scholar uttered a phrase that would repeat in his thoughts during the upcoming weeks. You are not heading up there to find proof, Mr. Marin. You are heading up there to be perceived. Jacob brushed it off with a laugh, thanked Thomas for his hours, and departed to start his trek. He possessed the sensible clarifications he required for the Cherokee cautions. Societal stress from historical events, normal human inclination to build stories around the unfamiliar, the mental requirement to clarify disasters and loss via storytelling. It all added up. Yet, Thomas's closing phrase stayed strangely stuck in the rear of his thoughts. The major discovery arrived 3 weeks into Jacob's study period. Previous to even stepping into the deep mountain zones, he had submitted an official request under the Freedom of Information Law for ranger journals and event files from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and nearby conserved territories, focusing specifically on the path between Rand Mountain and Klingman's Dome. The precise territory his nameless sender had cautioned him to stay away from. The paperwork showed up heavily blocked out. Big blocks of text were covered in black ink, stamped with excuse codes mentioning current inquiries or personal safety matters. Yet, what was left visible was interesting enough. Jacob laid out the sheets across his lodging desk, setting them in order of time. The entries stretched from the 1990s up to the current era, and specific trends showed up that bothered him regardless of his doubt. A log from July of 1998 read, "Unknown shouting vocalized close to Alum Cave Trail. Numerous onlookers. Hunt performed, no origin discovered, no lost individuals filed." noises did not equal any recognized forest animals. Another from October of 2003 stated, massive creature noted by morning walkers on the Appalachian Trail zone close to Roan High Knob. Description fails to equal bear, elk, or any recorded animal group. Footprint hunt performed. No prints discovered regardless of wet soil conditions. A report from April of 2007 read, Guard team lost for 9 hours during standard check of the Cataloochee sector. Wildlife officers eventually found at the walkway starting point, disoriented and powerless to clarify the missing hours. Both displayed markers of slight water loss, but argued they had only been away for roughly 2 hours. Satellite tracking validates a 9-hour missing period. Physical checkup non-definitive. The log reports became stranger. August 2011, an unapproved campfire was spotted from Ridge Overlook after darkness fell. A team was sent out to check the area and issue a ticket. When they arrived at the spot, no fire was found. There was no sign of a recent fire. The ground was cold, and there were no footprints or disturbed plants. December 2013. A lone walker reported seeing individuals standing up in the trees about half a mile away from the path near Klingman's Dome Access Road. A search was carried out. No sign of climbers or climbing gear was found. The walker was checked for possible cold exposure or confusion, and his physical health was found to be normal. But it was the last log report in the collection, from March of 2015, that made Jacob stop. Unlike the cold, official tone of the older reports, this specific one sounded like a caution. It stated that for all guard teams, if they were approached by individuals shouting for assistance from spots away from the trails, they must not follow the sounds without seeing the person in trouble clearly. They were told not to make long eye contact with any individuals showing strange behavior or physical features. They had to report anything that looked human but caused an eerie, unnatural feeling. They were ordered not to check areas alone and to keep radio contact open at all times. Jacob read those lines 3 times over. The wording was incredibly particular, especially the phrase about an eerie, unnatural feeling. That is the mental term for the uncomfortable feeling caused by something that looks almost human but not quite right. Why would a park report contain that kind of language? He phoned the Park Service office to ask where that specific rule came from. After being passed around to different people, he was finally told that the sheet must be a practical joke or a practice sheet that had been mixed up with the real files by mistake. They said no such official rule existed, yet the sheet had an official header, a real file number, and sat right among verified reports. Jacob placed it into his folder of unexplainable things, which was getting larger than he liked. Still, he reasoned that offices made errors, guards had a sense of humor, and there were logical explanations for everything. He needed to believe that. Jacob entered the mountain area during the opening week of October. The timing was planned on purpose, coming after the main tourist season ended, but before the winter weather made the high spots dangerous. He would be entirely by himself, which was his favorite way to operate. There was no team to alter his views, and there were no other sounds in his recordings, just him, his lenses, and the wild woods. The opening 3 days passed without incident, almost disappointingly so. He walked along heavily used paths, recorded beautiful fall views, and found nothing more unusual than a black bear looking through a trash can that had not been locked down well. He recorded several talking segments directly to his camera, explaining how conspiracy stories frequently came from the human habit of searching for patterns and focusing only on matching facts. He was completely comfortable, sure of himself, and clear in his speech. On the fourth day, he turned off the marked paths. He had spent weeks studying terrain maps, picking out spots that regular walkers hardly ever visited. His goal was an area northeast of Rand Mountain in a valley located right in a proven mobile phone dead zone. If strange events were taking place in these ridges, he reasoned they would happen in spots like this, isolated, unmonitored, and truly far away. The walk down into the valley took up most of the morning hours. The woods were thick, and the low bushes forced him to travel at a slow pace. By midday, his phone had lost all network connection, exactly as he expected. He was truly on his own now, miles from the closest path in a landscape that likely saw less than a dozen people each year. That was the moment he spotted the deer. It was standing in a small open space about 50 feet away, completely motionless. It was far too still. Deer are anxious animals, always on watch with twitching ears and moving tails. This particular one could have been made of stone. Jacob lifted his camera, thinking he could get some good footage of the local wildlife. Through the lens, he was able to see the animal much better. It was a large male with a full set of antlers. Its fur was the correct color, and its body shape seemed normal. Then it shifted its head to look directly at him. The motion was completely wrong. The turn was far too smooth and went around too far, with the neck twisting at an angle that should not be physically possible. The head swiveled nearly all the way around while the body stayed completely still, bringing the face of the deer into direct view. The eyes glowed white, resembling the way animals reflect light at night, except this was happening in the middle of the bright day. Jacob's finger froze right on the camera's start button. Through the view screen, he watched as the creature took a step forward toward his position. It was not the jumping, anxious motion of a normal deer, but a steady forward step, just like a human walking on two legs. It took another step, smooth and intentional. The camera was capturing everything. Jacob's logical thoughts screamed at him that this was merely a regular deer, that his eyes were playing tricks on him, and that the angle was creating a visual illusion. But a deeper, much older part of his mind was shouting something else entirely. It told him to run. The creature took a third step forward. Its mouth parted a bit, and Jacob was able to see that the teeth inside were completely wrong. There were far too many of them, and they were incredibly sharp. He pulled the camera down from his eye, and the exact moment he did, the creature in the clearing dashed away, but its movement was nothing like a deer. The creature shifted in a sideways, scuttling motion that made him think of a crab. It traveled unbelievably fast, disappearing into the thick trees within a few brief seconds. Jacob remained standing in the sudden quiet, his heart pounding hard against his chest and his fingers trembling. He cast his eyes down toward his recording gear, hoping deeply that the lens had caught the exact sight he had just witnessed. He pressed the button to play the video back. The footage was saved inside, showing the open space and the creature that resembled a deer but traveled incorrectly. However, the video file was damaged, cutting out every few moments with flat lines of visual static breaking across the screen. The sound file was even worse, filled with a steady clicking noise that definitely had not been audible during the actual event. Jacob replayed the clip over and over. The logical answers formed in his thoughts like organized troops, a piece of equipment breaking down, a trick of the mind brought on by intense stress, or an unusual animal action misunderstood because of a rush of adrenaline and high hopes. Yet he had witnessed exactly what he had witnessed. For the first single time across 6 full years of carrying out investigations, Jacob Marin experienced the icy sensation of true doubt. Jacob came out from the high ridges 2 days later, walking back towards settled areas with his damaged video file and his lost confidence. He required a conversation with individuals who actually spent their lives in these territories, people who handled the mountain landscape every single day instead of visiting it every now and then. He located them inside a tiny settlement just past Banner Elk, North Carolina. It was one of those spots that seemed more like a broad turn in the road than a real town, containing a fueling station, a basic store, a mailing office, and a small restaurant that likely had not altered its food choices since the decade of the 1980s. Jacob initiated his talks with great care. He had found out from past experience that residents in cut-off areas were frequently doubtful of outsiders, particularly individuals carrying recording gear who asked about odd events. He described himself as a photographer of nature who was deeply interested in the regional past and traditional tales. In the beginning, nobody would talk with him. They behaved politely but kept their distance, answering his inquiries with non-committal sounds and shifting the conversation to other topics. It did not change until his 3rd day staying in the settlement, after he had turned into a familiar sight at the local restaurant, that an individual finally began to talk openly. His name was Earl Hutchkins, a person in his 70s who had resided within these ridges for his entire lifespan. He had spent his time as a guide for hunters during his younger days, and now he used his retirement hours repairing tiny motors inside a workspace placed right behind his home. They were resting together on Earl's front porch, watching the sun dip down behind the high ridge line, when Jacob finally questioned him directly if he had ever seen any sight up in those hills that he could not find an answer for. Earl stayed quiet for a long span of time, so long that Jacob assumed he was not going to give an answer at all. Then, without turning his head toward Jacob, Earl spoke up. He stated that a person should not be traveling up in that wilderness on their own, because they take the individuals who arrive searching for them. Jacob's recording gear was running inside his pocket while he kept his speaking tone completely calm, asking who they were. Earl gestured toward the line of trees, which looked black now in the disappearing daylight, stating they were the ones who reside underneath. Jacob asked underneath what, and Earl clarified that they were under the ridges, inside the old mining tunnels and the cavern networks that travel down much further than any paper map displays. Earl finally turned his face to look at Jacob with completely serious eyes. He explained that the government blocked off the majority of those paths back in the year of 1968 following the cave-ins, but those cave-ins were not accidents at all. Strange events were taking place down in the dark, with workers disappearing, gear failing to run, and noises echoing in the blackness that should not have been possible. Jacob asked what kind of noises, and Earl described them as voices that were not human speech, things that were capable of repeating what people uttered and playing it right back at them. He said it was things that could sound exactly like a companion, a wife, or a child shouting for assistance from further down inside the tunnel. He added that intelligent men and skilled workers would follow those familiar voices directly into the black areas, and the majority of them never walked back out again. Jacob experienced a sudden chill despite the warm air of the evening. He asked about the individuals who did make it back out, and Earl noted that they did not speak much about the event because they were not truly able to, as their minds were completely shattered from witnessing a sight down there that human thoughts were never designed to handle. Earl stood up from his place, showing that the talk was over. As Jacob gathered his items to walk away, Earl shared one final piece of information, mentioning that a woman named Arden Pike resided in the settlement. Her spouse had been a worker on the geological mapping projects back in the decade of the 1970s before everything was blocked off completely, and though she might choose not to talk, she owned the old charts. Arden Pike lived inside a tiny home located right at the boundary of the settlement, with a yard filled with untamed herbs and forest flowers. She was in the later years of her 80s, slender and sharp-sighted, possessing fingers that shook a little bit as she served hot tea into worn cups. Jacob had telephoned her ahead of time, clarifying that Earl was the one who had guided him to her door. That earned him an invitation, but not necessarily trust. "My husband Samuel worked for the Geological Survey," Arden said, settling into a chair by the window. "It was back when the government was still interested in mapping what was under these mountains instead of just sealing it away." Earl mentioned he might have made maps of the area. Arden nodded slowly. He did, and what he found down there haunted him until the day he died. She stood, moving to an old desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, she produced a rolled piece of paper yellowed with age. She spread it on the table between them. Jacob leaned forward, his pulse quickening. The map showed the mountain region between Rand Mountain and Klingman's Dome, exactly the corridor he'd been warned to avoid. But this wasn't a typical topographical map. This showed what lay beneath. Tunnels, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, forming a network far more extensive than Jacob had imagined possible. They branched and connected, creating a subterranean maze that spanned miles. In the center of the map, a region was circled in red ink. The circle encompassed an area of several square miles. Inside the circle, in Samuel's handwriting, were two words: the corridor. "What is the corridor?" Jacob asked. Arden's hand shook as she touched the map. Samuel said it was the main arterial. All the smaller tunnels, the natural caves, the mining shafts, they all connected back to this central system. And it went deep, deeper than they had equipment to measure properly. Did he explore it? He tried. The government sent teams down in the early 1970s trying to map the extent of the network. Samuel was part of the last survey team before they sealed everything. She paused, her eyes distant. He came home different, shaking, wouldn't eat for days, and had nightmares for months. What did he see down there? He wouldn't tell me, not fully, but he said the tunnels weren't empty. There were things living down there, things that had been there long before humans started digging, and they didn't like being disturbed. She pointed to several notations on the map, small X marks scattered throughout the tunnel system. These are where they found evidence of habitation, not human habitation. Whatever lived down there built structures, used tools, and had some kind of civilization. But it wasn't like anything recognized by anthropology or archaeology. Jacob's mind raced. This was either an elaborate hoax or evidence of something genuinely extraordinary. Did he take photos or collect samples? Arden shook her head. Everything was confiscated. Once the government decided to seal the tunnels, all documentation was classified. Samuel was threatened with prosecution if he spoke about what he'd seen. This map, she tapped it gently. He drew from memory after they took the originals. He wanted someone to know the truth. Why show me? Because you're going to go down there anyway. I can see it in your eyes. You've already seen something that shook you. Now you need to know if it's real. She rolled up the map and handed it to him. "Take it. Maybe you'll be smart enough to turn back, but I doubt it. People who go looking for the truth in these mountains rarely find what they expect." Jacob left Arden's house as darkness settled over the town. The map felt heavy in his backpack, weighted with more than just paper and ink. He knew what he had to do next. Jacob spent the next week preparing. He studied the map obsessively, cross-referencing it with modern topographical surveys and satellite imagery. He located the likely position of the sealed mine entrance that Arden's husband had indicated as the primary access point to the corridor. His rational mind offered countless reasons not to pursue this. The mine would be sealed. It would be dangerous. He had no spelunking experience. He would be trespassing on federal land, but he had also seen the knot deer. He had read the ranger logs. He had spoken to people who genuinely believed something lived beneath these mountains, and if there was any truth to it, any truth at all, he needed to document it. He found the mine entrance on the 13th day of October, exactly where Arden's map suggested it would be. A metal gate, industrial and imposing, blocked a tunnel entrance cut into the mountainside. The gate was reinforced with heavy bolts, and a metal plaque warned in bold letters, "Dangerous, area unstable, entry prohibited." Jacob examined the gate closely. Despite the warning suggesting decades of abandonment, the bolts looked relatively new. The metal showed little rust. Someone had maintained this seal recently. He circled the site looking for alternative entry points. The tunnel mouth was large, probably 10 feet high and 12 feet wide, suggesting it had been a significant mining operation. Plants had grown up all around the entry point, but not as much as he would think for an area blocked off since the decade of the 1960s. Then he caught a sound from inside the shaft. It was soft but very clear. Jacob stopped moving and listened. The noise came a second time. It was a steady sound resembling metal dragging against stone or something shifting around. He slid out his sound recorder and pressed it flat against the iron barrier. The noise became clearer now, dragging, intentional, and following a steady sequence. Then it ceased. In the sudden quiet, Jacob caught another noise. It was something that made his fingers go completely cold. Footsteps. They were his own footsteps. The exact speed and rhythm of his own walking pace replayed from deep within the dark tunnel. He pulled back fast from the gate, his chest pounding. Whatever was inside that space was mimicking him, repeating the exact sounds he produced. Jacob should have departed right then. Every inner warning told him to get away from that location, to walk back toward the town, and to drop his investigation completely. Instead, he placed his camera on its stand, pointed the lens toward the gate, and started a video. "This is the entry to what residents call the corridor," he stated, his voice sounding firmer than he actually felt inside. "I am recording proof of what seem to be sound anomalies, noises coming from inside a shaft that has been blocked off for more than 50 years. He paused and listened closely. The repeating noises had stopped. The shaft was completely quiet once more. "I am going to try to capture a recording from inside the mine by using a long audio cable." Jacob had brought the right gear for this. From his pack, he took out a long line of wire and a tiny, waterproof microphone. The iron barrier had an open space right near the dirt where water erosion had worn away a gap between the metal and the rock. The space was quite small, perhaps only 3 inches, but it was wide enough for his microphone to pass through. He lowered the small device down through the opening, letting out 20 feet of line. The microphone hung somewhere in the deep black space past the gate. He turned on the recording gear and waited. For 5 minutes, there was absolutely nothing but quiet. Jacob inspected his gear, making sure everything was running correctly. Then the noises started. He heard numerous voices speaking in a whisper, not actual words, but vocal sounds that strongly suggested speech and communication. The whispers crossed over one another, forming an unsettling choir. Below the sound of the voices, that same metal dragging noise returned, steady and intentional. Then, cutting right through the other noises, came a sound that made Jacob's skin crawl. A child laughing, clear, distinct, and completely human. Finally, he heard the sound of something massive shifting deeper inside the tunnel, not walking on feet, but dragging along the floor. The whispers suddenly joined together into words, or sounds very close to words. In perfect unison, the voices uttered, "Come down." Jacob jerked the line back, pulling the microphone out through the narrow gap so quickly that he scraped his knuckles against the rough metal. He turned off the recording gear with shaking hands. His doubt, his 6 years of proving stories wrong, and his systematic approach all shattered in front of the audio he had just captured. This was not a trick of the mind. It was not caused by the surrounding weather or an error in what he was hearing. There was something living inside that mountain peak, something completely aware, something that knew he was standing out there, and something that desired for him to enter. Jacob walked for 3 miles before he finally stopped, his fingers still trembling. He located a fairly level space away from the main walkway, put up his tent, and forced himself to listen to the saved audio file. In the disappearing daylight through his headphones, the noises sounded even more alarming than they had in person. The whispering voices, the dragging sounds, the child's laughter that felt wrong and far too precise, and those closing words telling him to come down. He saved several copies of the audio file, backing it up to his phone, his portable computer, and a digital network storage space. This was real proof, the exact kind of evidence that could alter everything, but proof of what exactly? He still had no answer. The following morning, Jacob made a firm choice. He would search the grounds surrounding the mine entry for any additional signs before he tried to get in touch with local authorities about his findings. If there was more to record, he needed to locate it. He worked in a systematic way, moving outward in a widening circle from the blocked tunnel, recording every detail with his camera lens. Most of what he located was very ordinary, common forest trash, animal holes, and worn rock shapes. Then, inside a tiny ditch about half a mile away from the mine entry, he spotted something that should not have been there. It was a backpack, old and weathered, with the fabric worn down by years of exposure to the elements, though it had not been there for decades. The artificial fabric would have fallen apart much more if it had been left there since the 1960s. Jacob took a photo of the bag exactly where it lay before he carefully opened it up. Inside, he found a container for water marked with the year 1993, a moldy map of the trails, and a small wallet containing an identification card. The face on the card belonged to a young woman who was smiling and full of life. The name on the card read Jennifer Hastings. Jacob's fingers shook as he took out his phone to look up the name along with the words "Missing Person Appalachian." The search results appeared instantly. Jennifer Hastings, 24 years of age, had vanished while walking the Appalachian Trail in June of the year 1993. She was last spotted near the Ran Mountain Zone and was never located. The file stayed open but cold. He had just stumbled upon evidence from a 30-year-old missing person file. Jacob kept up his search with a brand new sense of urgency. 20 feet away from the bag, halfway covered under fallen leaves, he located a shoe. The style belonged to an older era and the fabric was worn, but it was still easy to recognize. He recorded it with a photo and then searched a wider area. Additional objects appeared from his search: a small stove used for camping, a light source that resembled a design from the 1980s, and a tiny camera that existed before modern digital screens. And then he located the photographs. They were old, self-developing prints, faded and damaged by water, but the images were still visible. The initial few pictures displayed ordinary hiking views, mountain scenes, walkway signs, and tent setups. But the final 3 photographs made Jacob's stomach turn. They had been captured inside an actual tunnel. The flash from the camera had lit up rough stone walls, and in every single picture, standing right at the outer edge of the light beam, were shapes. They were human-like shapes, very tall and slender, possessing body proportions that were not quite correct. In the final photograph, one of those shapes had moved closer, much closer. It was near enough that its facial features were visible. It was a face that looked almost human, but it was stretched out incorrectly, with eyes that were far too massive and placed too far apart from each other. The mouth was wide open in a shape that could have been a smile or a scream. Jacob sat back on his heels, his thoughts spinning from the sight. These were not fake pictures. They were genuine, decades-old prints discovered right alongside the items of a verified missing person. This served as proof that whatever resided within these passages had been capturing people for at least 30 years, and likely much longer. He was no longer trying to disprove anything. He was recording a situation that the authorities either had no knowledge of or had actively hidden from the public. The logical explanations had vanished entirely. Jacob Marin, a professional doubter, had uncovered proof of something he could not explain, and he had absolutely no idea what he should do with it. Jacob was walking back towards settled areas, his bag heavy with this newfound evidence, when he ran into them. 2 men stood on the path ahead, dressed in deep dark outfits that lacked any identifying labels or official symbols. They stepped out onto the walkway so suddenly that Jacob stopped completely in his tracks. One of them called him by name, stating it directly rather than asking. They already knew exactly who he was. Jacob asked who they were, his hand naturally moving toward his camera gear. The second man replied that his identity was not important, but what mattered was where Jacob had been traveling and what he had witnessed. Jacob tried to explain that he was just walking, that he was a photographer of nature with legal permits, but the first man cut him off. He demanded to know if Jacob had entered the restricted zones or seen anything out of the ordinary. Jacob's thoughts raced. These individuals were definitely not park rangers. Their outfits were wrong, and their behavior was incorrect. The way they spoke suggested background training in the military or intelligence fields. Jacob answered carefully, stating he did not know what they meant by restricted zones and that he had only been on public walkways. The second man took a step closer, telling Jacob that they knew all about his deep inquiry, his questions regarding the blocked mining projects, and his discovery of the main passage. Jacob began to say he was just taking photos, but the first man broke in again, explaining they were not there to place him under arrest. Instead, they were there to provide information that could keep him alive, warning him that if he kept walking into that main passage, he would never walk back out. He added that individuals had been vanishing from this territory for longer than Jacob could possibly picture. He stated that the government knew the reason why, and they had made a firm decision that the danger of public awareness was far worse than the danger of ongoing disappearances. Jacob felt a wave of anger rise through his initial fear. He stated that they were openly admitting to a massive cover-up, allowing people to die while doing absolutely nothing to stop it. The second man replied coldly that they were admitting to nothing at all, but were simply offering him solid advice. He told Jacob to take his video clips, take his written notes, and depart immediately. He ordered him to publish absolutely nothing, discuss the topic with no one, and forget every single detail he believed he had discovered. Jacob asked what would happen if he refused to comply, causing the two men to share a brief look. The first man spoke up again, his voice sounding even colder than before. He warned Jacob that he would simply join the long list of individuals who went searching for reality inside these ridges. He stated there was a very specific reason the missing person count was so incredibly high in this territory, noting that not every single person who vanished did so by pure accident. The threat was completely clear. Jacob's fingers tightened against his camera strap, stating that they were threatening his life. The second man corrected him, saying it was a warning rather than a threat, and that there was a major difference between the two. He added that they would actually prefer for him to survive the situation, but personal preferences do not decide final outcomes. With that, they stepped right off the walkway, disappearing back into the thick forest with incredible speed and skill. Within a few brief moments, they were totally gone, leaving Jacob standing entirely on his own on the path with a racing heart and a bag full of evidence. He stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just taken place. Then he came to a firm decision. He was not going to leave just yet. If they were this desperate to frighten him away, it meant his inquiry had gotten incredibly close to something they desperately wanted to keep out of sight. And Jacob Marin, despite all his skepticism, had always been a very stubborn individual. He had arrived to prove conspiracy stories wrong, but instead he had uncovered proof of a real conspiracy. He was not going to walk away from it now. Jacob waited until the evening hours arrived before he went back to the mine entry. He moved forward with great care, keeping watch for the men in uniform, but he saw nobody around. The forest was entirely quiet, almost far too quiet. The blocked-off iron gate looked completely different now. When Jacob had departed from it earlier that morning, the iron barrier had been completely whole and tightly bolted shut. Now, the heavy metal was twisted and bent outward. The thick bolts had been snapped off entirely or ripped away from their supports. The opening was now wide enough for a regular person to squeeze inside or for something else to step out. Jacob's camera lens was already capturing video as he moved closer. When he spoke, his voice was barely louder than a soft whisper. He noted that the blocked gate had been broken open and that the damage seemed very fresh. He explained that he could not tell if the force had come from the inside or the outside, but the heavy metal had been twisted with incredible power. He shined the beam of his light right through the new opening. The passage extended far beyond the entrance, fading away into absolute blackness. The air flowing out from the deep space was freezing cold and carried an odor that smelled of minerals and decay. It felt completely wrong. This was absolute madness, and Jacob knew it was madness to step into an unsafe, dark mine tunnel entirely on his own at night, especially after receiving direct threats from strange government agents. Every logical thought he had left inside him screamed at him to turn around and leave. but he had spent 6 full years proving myths were wrong. He had spent his entire adult life demanding real proof, solid evidence, and scientific accuracy. Now he was standing right on the edge of something that completely contradicted everything he believed he understood about the world. He simply had to know the truth. Jacob squeezed his body through the narrow opening in the gate, his bag dragging against the rough metal edges. The bright beam of his flashlight cut through the heavy blackness, revealing a long tunnel that extended much further than he had ever anticipated. The interior walls were partly made of natural cave stone and partly shaped by human digging tools. Old, weathered wooden support beams still stood at different intervals along the path. The ground was rough and uneven, covered in broken rocks and pieces of what appeared to be very old mining gear. He advanced with great caution, recording every single detail with his camera lens. The passage sloped down, traveling deeper and deeper into the heart of the mountain. After he walked about 50 feet, Jacob spotted a detail that caused him to pause. The tunnel walls were not just made of common stone and dirt. There were actual carvings. He took a few steps closer, pointing his light beam directly onto the smooth rock face. The carvings were simple but very intentional, showing shapes that looked roughly like human figures, but they were stretched out incorrectly, looking impossibly tall and thin. Their heads were entirely smooth without any facial features, except for massive almond-shaped eyes. These were definitely not modern carvings. The stones surrounding the figures showed clear signs of extreme age and weather wear. These markings could easily have been carved there decades ago, or perhaps even longer. Jacob captured photographs of every single detail, his hands growing much steadier now that he was focused entirely on recording the facts. This was real evidence. This was solid proof of something very real, even if he did not completely understand what it meant just yet. The passage sloped down even deeper. Jacob marked his route as he moved forward, leaving tiny reflective tape strips that he could easily track to find his way back out. He had walked down roughly 200 feet when the narrow passage suddenly opened up into a much larger underground room. Jacob's flashlight beam was not strong enough to light up the massive space. He could see the stone walls extending far past where his light could reach, and the ceiling disappeared entirely into the blackness above. Scattered all across the floor of the room were bones. They were not animal remains, they were human bones. Jacob felt a wave of illness rise in his throat. There were dozens of them, perhaps even hundreds, laid out in specific arrangements that suggested they had been placed there on purpose, forming circles within circles, with straight lines spreading outward from a middle spot. This was a resting place, or something far worse. He forced his hands to keep documenting the sight, his camera recording the terrible scene. He counted skulls, spotting at least 30 within the reach of his light beam, representing decades of lost individuals who had never been discovered by search teams. He wondered how many people had lost their lives down in this dark space, and how many had walked into these passages never to return. Then he caught the noise again, that low humming sound he had first picked up with his outer microphone. But now that he was inside the mountain, the sound seemed to come from everywhere, vibrating right through the solid rock and through his own body. It felt almost mechanical, but not completely, resembling a machine built by an entity that had never actually seen a machine before. The sound was coming from a spot deeper inside the large room, and Jacob advanced toward it. His logical thoughts were finally quieted. He was far past logic and doubt now. He was following a basic human drive, the deep need to know and comprehend, even at a terrible personal cost. His light beam finally illuminated the origin of the noise. At the very far end of the room was a doorway. It was not carved out of rough rock, and it had not been built by human miners. It was far too smooth and possessed a perfectly straight geometric shape. The material reflected his flashlight beam in a way that regular stone never could, looking almost like metal, but not quite. Past the doorway, a soft, faint light emitted a quiet glow. It was not the light of a fire, and it was not electric. It was something else entirely. Jacob stepped up toward the threshold, his camera continuing to record everything. Whatever took place next would be fully captured on video. Suddenly, he heard a shifting movement right behind his back. Jacob spun around quickly, his flashlight sweeping across the large room. For a brief second, he saw absolutely nothing. Then, right at the outer edge of his light beam, shapes began to form out of the deep blackness. They were tall, impossibly tall. Their limbs were far too long, and their joints seemed to bend in too many directions. They moved forward with a smooth, flowing grace that looked completely unlike a human gait. Their heads turned slowly to face him, smooth, pale countenances with those massive, dark eyes that reflected his flashlight beam just like glass mirrors. One of the figures advanced closer, tilting its head far to the side, inspecting him the exact way a researcher might inspect a specimen. Then it opened its mouth, parting its jaws far wider than any natural body structure should ever allow, and it spoke aloud. Jacob. It was his own voice, perfect, exact, and completely identical. His own speaking tone was being played right back at him by an entity that was absolutely not a human being. Jacob's camera captured every single detail. Operating entirely on pure survival instinct, his hand kept the recording gear perfectly steady and running, even as his thoughts struggled to make sense of the sight before his eyes. There were more of them appearing now, 6, 8, a dozen of the figures emerging out from the heavy darkness that surrounded his position, staring at him with those frightening eyes. The very first creature spoke a second time, still using Jacob's exact voice, "Come down." Then a different creature spoke up, but its voice was completely altered. It was a woman's voice, young and filled with terror. "Help me." It was perhaps the voice of Jennifer Hastings, captured, saved, and replayed across the years. Another figure spoke, "Daddy." It was a child's voice, broken with tears. They were mimics, every single one of them. They were gathering human voices, holding onto them, and playing them back in arrangements that suggested they were attempting to speak, to communicate, and to comprehend. Jacob understood with a sudden, awful clarity exactly what he was looking at. These were not monsters in the traditional sense of the word. They were something else entirely, something that had lived deep inside these mountain peaks for much longer than human beings had ever inhabited the land. It was an entity that had observed humans, studied them, and tried to understand them by copying their vocal sounds, their daily patterns, and their actions. The blocked-off tunnels, the secret government actions, the heavy warnings, it all connected in a terrible way. There was a living force beneath the Appalachian mountains, something highly intelligent that had been there first. "I need to go," Jacob uttered aloud, his actual voice cracking under the intense strain. The creatures made no physical movement to block his path. They simply stood there and watched him, their heads tilting all at once in a synchronized motion. Jacob backed away slowly, keeping his camera lens pointing at them and running, his flashlight beam sweeping across the gathered shapes. The moment he reached the entry of the narrow tunnel, he turned and ran. Behind him, he caught his own voice echoing right through the chamber space. "I need to go, I need to go, I need to go." They were learning. They were always learning. Jacob sprinted through the dark passage, his flashlight beam jumping wildly around the stone. Behind his back, he heard shifting movement, rapid skittering noises hitting against the rock floor. They were tracking him. He snatched his reflective tape strips as he dashed past, confirming his correct route back toward the entry point. His breath escaped his chest in ragged gasps. His bag bounced hard against his back, heavy with the saved files, with the real proof. The passage felt much longer now, extending out without an end. Had he truly journeyed this far down into the earth, the total distance seemed impossible to cross. Behind him, his very own speaking tone shouted out, "Jacob, Jacob, Jacob." They were closing the distance. He sprinted around a sharp turn, and his light beam landed on an object that had not been there during his walk down. It was a metallic structure, far too smooth and perfectly shaped to be a natural part of the cave. It stretched all the way from the floor to the ceiling, blocking the majority of the passage. There was an open space left that was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Jacob did not pause to think. He shoved his body forward into the opening, his bag catching tightly on the rough metal edge. For a terrifying second, he was stuck fast, trapped completely between the metal structure and the solid stone wall. Then something tore. His bag ripped open, and he tumbled right through to the opposite side. He scrambled back up to his feet and kept running. The entry point was straight ahead. He was able to see the dark night sky through the twisted gap in the iron gate, blessed darkness that signified total freedom. Jacob burst right through the opening, falling flat onto the rocky ground outside. He rolled over quickly, coming up into a low crouch. He pointed his light beam straight back at the tunnel mouth. The creatures had halted right at the threshold. They stood just inside the entry point, forming a wall of pale shapes with two long limbs and tilted heads. They did not step out. They could not step out, or perhaps they chose not to. Jacob did not stick around to discover the reason. He snatched his torn bag and sprinted into the thick forest, finding his way by the moonlight and his memory, not halting for a moment until he arrived at his vehicle 2 miles away. He threw all his items into the car and drove away fast, away from the mountain peaks, away from the passage, and away from the entities that watched from underneath the earth. It was only when he had traveled 50 miles away on a major highway filled with bright street lights and regular traffic that he finally permitted himself to pull over and inspect his recording gear. The camera lens was still capturing file data, and the memory card inside was completely whole. Jacob possessed the file's actual recorded proof of a living force that should not exist. He had real proof. Jacob Marin never made his video clips public. 3 days following his escape from the dark passage, he was contacted by federal officers, proper agents this time, carrying real shields and official paperwork. They behaved politely but stayed completely firm. They explained that his video clips were classified files connected to an active national security operation. His memory card, his written notes, and his recorded talks were all seized on the spot. His home was thoroughly searched, and his digital network backups were accessed and permanently deleted. Every single piece of evidence he had gathered was either confiscated or destroyed completely. He was presented with a direct choice: sign a legal non-disclosure contract, and receive a major financial payment for his help on a secret government assignment, or face legal prosecution for entering restricted lands, disrupting federal actions, and a dozen additional charges that would guarantee he spent many years inside a federal prison facility. Jacob signed his name. The payment amount was large enough for him to reside comfortably for the remainder of his lifespan, provided he never uttered a single word regarding what he had uncovered beneath the ridges. His digital communication accounts were permanently deleted, and his documentary photo collection was stripped from every single internet platform. Inside a single week, it was as if Jacob Marin, the professional doubter and myth prover, had never even existed. He relocated to a tiny apartment inside a city placed far away from any mountain peaks. He stopped practicing photography altogether, and he did not look into any mysteries anymore. He lived a quiet, completely nameless life, trying his best to forget every sight he had witnessed. But during the late hours of the night, he would occasionally catch his own voice echoing inside the blackness of his bedroom. Jacob, Jacob, Jacob. The mimics had successfully learned his name. They would hold onto his memory, even if the rest of the world was forced to forget he existed. As for what took place with the gathered files, officially absolutely nothing happened. Officially, there were no files at all. Officially, Jacob Marin had gone through a mental health emergency during a solo walking trip and had been handled with care and privacy by worried public officers. Yet 3 backpackers exploring unmarked areas close to Rand Mountain during the following spring season stumbled upon an odd sight: a discarded bag containing a damaged camera and a whole memory card. They turned the camera's power on and watched the saved video clips. Before they were able to decide what actions to take with the file, men dressed in deep dark outfits showed up directly at their homes. The video clips were confiscated on the spot. The backpackers were questioned completely separate from one another and strongly advised to forget every detail they had witnessed. But one of those backpackers had operated smartly. Before the officers arrived at her home, she had uploaded a 30-second clip of the video onto an obscure file-sharing website, posting the file without adding a single comment or any context. The clip eventually found its way through internet conspiracy message boards and supernatural websites. The majority of viewers dismissed the footage as obvious computer-generated imagery. A few viewed it as the finest practical joke they had ever encountered, and a very select few recognized the footage for exactly what it was. Genuine proof of an entity that resides below the Appalachian Mountains. The last frame of that leaked video clip displays what Jacob witnessed during his final moments inside the passage. It showed a massive metallic door, smooth and impossibly perfect, placed right into the deepest section of the mountain. A hand is reaching out toward the camera lens, looking pale with 6 fingers, and the joints are bending in paths that suggest an entity that is not quite human. There are words carved directly into the stone right beside the door, worn down by countless years. We were here first. The conspiracy believers were correct. The warnings were fully justified and the cover-up was completely real. Jacob Marin, the individual who journeyed out to prove the myths were false, discovered the truth that shattered his existence. Particular things are buried for a very specific reason. Certain passages were never intended to be explored, and particular questions should never receive an answer. The Appalachian Mountains hold onto their secrets. The government keeps up its total silence. and the creatures below persist with their patient waiting. Occasionally, another person journeys out looking for reality inside the oldest mountains in America. The majority of them do not return, and the ones who do make it back are never the same again. Picture discovering that your government has been keeping the truth from you regarding the biggest danger humanity has ever encountered. Picture finding out that while public officers inform you that everything is completely normal, they have been secretly constructing underground cities for themselves and their relatives. Picture understanding that 300 million Americans have been classified as acceptable losses in a disaster that is not a question of if, but simply a matter of when it takes place. This is a tale grounded in actual geological science, real government guidelines, and the frightening possibility that the facts regarding Yellowstone are being kept out of sight right now. What takes place when the biggest natural disaster in human history has been anticipated, planned for, and kept hidden from the general public? When a junior geologist runs into proof that the Yellowstone supervolcano is not actually dormant, but is instead being actively managed, he finds out that some facts are worth killing to protect. Special thanks go to Nicola for this amazing story concept and the detailed study work that made this account possible. Yellowstone National Park Monitoring Station, October the 15th, 2014. The cup of coffee had turned cold hours ago, but Eli Grant scarcely even noticed. His eyes stayed locked onto the seismic data scrolling across his viewing screen, watching patterns that should not exist move across the monitor like digital ghosts. At 24 years of age, fresh out of graduate school with a geology degree from Colorado State, Eli had spent the last 3 months working as a USGS intern, finding out that keeping watch over America's most hazardous supervolcano was mostly common data collection, broken up by moments of pure fear. This was one of those specific moments. The tiny quakes were coming from depths that made his stomach turn, 15 miles down, much deeper than any saved activity in Yellowstone's 30-year digital monitoring history. The frequency of the movements was wrong as well, grouped together in tight bursts rather than the random scattering that is common for ordinary geothermal activity. Every individual tremor registered between 1.2 and 1.8 on the Richter scale, small enough to be ignored on their own, but together they formed a picture that made Eli's fingers tremble as he reached over to grab his phone. Before he was able to dial his supervisor's number, the screen flickered. The strange data vanished entirely, replaced by a steady green line that showed normal background activity. A computer-generated message popped up, calibration complete, data archived. Eli stared blankly at the empty screen. 15 minutes of completely unprecedented, deep seismic activity had just been wiped away as if it had never even taken place. He quickly moved through the computer networks to the backup servers, his fingers moving across the keyboard with a growing sense of desperation. The raw data files were completely gone, the automated alerts had been wiped clean, and even the emergency notice log displayed absolutely nothing but standard system upkeep. Working late again, kids. Eli spun around quickly to discover Karen Holt standing right in the doorway, her park ranger uniform remaining crisp despite the late hour of the night. At 52, Karen had been patrolling the back areas of Yellowstone for more than 2 decades, and her weathered face held the kind of deep knowledge that came from watching the park's conditions shift along with the seasons. Karen, did you feel any movement about an hour ago? Any small tremors? She inspected his face with great care before stepping inside the room and shutting the door tightly behind her. You spotted something on the monitors. Deep quakes, deeper than any single entry in the database, but they are gone now, wiped completely clean like they never even happened. Karen stayed quiet for a long span of time, her eyes remaining fixed on the cleared data lines. When she finally spoke up, her voice held a heavy weight that Eli had never heard from her before. How long have you been working out here, Eli? 3 months. Long enough to comprehend what you are looking at, but not long enough to understand what you are not supposed to witness. She slid a chair over right beside him. Let me ask you a question. Do you know the reason why they placed the monitoring station out here instead of putting it closer to the caldera? Eli simply shrugged his shoulders. Better communication links, I assumed. Easier access for maintenance. That's what they tell the interns. Karen's fingers drummed against the desk. The real reason is that certain types of data collection work better from a distance. It gives you time to manage what actually goes into the public record. The realization hit Eli like a physical blow. Are you saying they're hiding seismic data? I'm saying that 23 years of watching this place has taught me that Yellowstone keeps secrets, and some people are very invested in keeping those secrets buried. She stood up, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. Don't start asking questions you're not ready to answer, Eli. This park isn't just about geysers. After she left, Eli sat alone in the monitoring station, staring at the clean, normal readouts. But Karen's warning had sparked something dangerous, curiosity. He pulled up the archive database and began searching for gaps, periods where data might have been scrubbed before. What he found made his pulse quicken. Small deletions in 2009, 2004, and 1997. It was always deep seismic activity, always erased within hours of being recorded, and always during periods when public attention was focused elsewhere, like economic crashes, natural disasters, or political scandals. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Eli spent the rest of the night copying every piece of raw data he could access onto external drives, working with the methodical precision of someone who understood that some opportunities only came once. By dawn, he had assembled a fragmentary picture of Yellowstone's hidden activity dating back 15 years. The supervolcano wasn't dormant. It was being watched, monitored, and most importantly, hidden from public view. As the sun rose over the Yellowstone River, Eli Grant became the first person outside the conspiracy to see the full scope of what was coming. What he didn't know was that his discovery had already been noted by systems designed to catch exactly this kind of unauthorized access. In a secure facility 300 miles away, automated alerts were already being generated, and decisions were being made about what to do with a curious young geologist who had seen too much. Chapter 1, The Official Story, Yellowstone National Park Headquarters, March 22, 2015. The press briefing room was packed with reporters from every major network, their cameras trained on the panel of scientists seated behind a table, adorned with official USGS and National Park Service seals. Outside, early spring snow dusted the peaks surrounding Mammoth Hot Springs, But inside the room, the atmosphere was warm with the heat of television lights and simmering questions about Yellowstone's recent activity. Eli stood at the back of the room, his USGS badge giving him access to the media event despite his junior status. In the 5 months since he'd first witnessed the data scrubbing, he'd kept his head down and his mouth shut, but he'd also kept watching. The patterns were becoming clearer and more disturbing with each passing week. The chief park scientist, Janet Morrison, stepped up to the microphone, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense expression. "Good morning. I want to address the speculation that's been circulating online regarding recent seismic activity in Yellowstone National Park." Eli noticed how she avoided mentioning the source of that speculation. A viral video showing hundreds of elk and bison streaming out of the Lamar Valley in what appeared to be a coordinated exodus. The footage had been taken by a tourist 3 weeks earlier and had garnered over 2 million views before park officials managed to provide alternative explanations. Based on our continuous monitoring of the Yellowstone volcanic system, Morrison continued, I can state categorically that no eruption is imminent. The seismic activity recorded over the past month falls well within normal parameters for this geologically active region. A reporter from CNN raised her hand. But what about the animal migrations? Local ranchers are reporting unusual behavior in wildlife populations. Seasonal migration patterns can vary significantly based on weather conditions, food availability, and natural population cycles, Morrison replied smoothly. What some observers have interpreted as unusual behavior is actually quite normal for this time of year. Eli bit back the urge to laugh. He'd seen the internal memos describing the animal movements as unprecedented and potentially indicative of subsurface environmental changes. The scientists on this panel knew exactly what was causing the animals to flee, but they were standing in front of cameras and lying about it with practiced ease. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, each one deflected with rehearsed responses that provided just enough technical detail to sound authoritative while revealing absolutely nothing of substance. As the briefing came to an end and reporters started walking out, Eli stayed behind near the rear of the room, watching the scientists pack up their things. An impressive performance. Eli turned around to find a man in his 40s wearing a FEMA windbreaker. An identification card hung from a cord around his neck, identifying him as Deputy Director Marcus Webb. The briefing was very professional, Webb said. Of course, the real challenge is not managing the news media. It is managing the logistics. Webb's smile was friendly, but his eyes stayed cold. You are Eli Grant, are you not? The intern who has been asking interesting questions. Eli's mouth went dry. I do not know what you mean. Database searches at strange hours, unusual downloading activity. Information technology security flags that kind of behavior automatically. Webb stepped closer, dropping his voice. Do not worry. Curiosity is natural in your line of work, but there are some areas where curiosity can become problematic. Are you threatening me? I am offering advice. FEMA has been conducting training exercises in this region for several months now. Interagency coordination, emergency response protocols, that sort of thing. You might have noticed our vehicles around the park." Eli had noticed. Black SUVs and unmarked trucks had been appearing at different locations throughout Yellowstone, always accompanied by workers who claimed to be conducting routine training exercises. The timing felt highly suspicious. Why increase emergency preparedness training just as seismic activity was being actively removed from public records? What kind of training? Webb's smile widened. Zone 5 evacuation protocols. Very comprehensive, very necessary. He handed Eli a business card. "If you ever want to know more about emergency preparedness, give me a call. But remember, some knowledge comes with responsibilities." After Webb walked away, Eli stood alone in the empty briefing room, turning the card over in his hands. Zone 5 evacuation protocols. He had never heard the term before, despite his security clearance and access to most FEMA documentation. That night, he spent hours searching through official databases, finding references to Zones 1 through 4, but absolutely nothing about Zone 5. Whatever Webb was talking about, it existed outside the normal chain of command and public accountability. The realization sent a chill down Eli's spine that had nothing to do with the late spring snow falling outside his apartment window. 3 days later, Karen Holt found him in the monitoring station, hunched over his computer with the intensity of someone racing against time. "You are digging deeper," she observed, not bothering to make it a question. "Someone has to. They are lying to everyone, Karen. The seismic data, the animal behavior, the FEMA exercises, none of it matches the story they are telling the public." Karen closed the door and turned on the white noise generator that was supposedly used to prevent electronic eavesdropping during sensitive conferences. "What do you know about the Deep Bore Project?" "I have never heard of it." Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was a joint USGS and military operation that ran from 2008 to 2012. The cover story was the installation of advanced seismic monitoring equipment in previously inaccessible areas of the park. And the real story. Pressure venting. They were drilling down to the magma chamber and installing systems designed to release pressure in controlled amounts, potentially delaying or preventing a catastrophic eruption. Eli stared at her. "That is actually brilliant. Why would they hide something like that?" "Because it did not work. The magma chamber is too large and too unstable. The venting systems were supposed to buy us decades. Instead, they may have accelerated the timeline." Karen's face was grim. One of the contractors died during the installation phase. Officially, it was an industrial accident. Unofficially, he was murdered to prevent him from talking about what he discovered down there. What did he discover? That the eruption is not a matter of if, Eli. It is a matter of when, and when is a lot sooner than anyone is willing to admit publicly. As Karen left him alone with this revelation, Eli found himself staring at the sanitized seismic readouts with a brand new understanding. The data removal was not just about hiding Yellowstone's activity from the public. It was about hiding the failure of a desperate attempt to prevent a massive natural disaster. And somewhere, people with access to the real data were making plans that did not include the 300 million Americans living in the path of danger. Chapter 2, The Elite Plan, USGS Regional Office, Denver, September 14, 2016. The security badge scanner beeped as Eli swiped his credential, granting him access to the restricted archives beneath the Denver Federal Building. 18 months had passed since his first glimpse of the conspiracy, and his official duties had gradually shifted from basic monitoring to special projects. This was the euphemism for working on data sets that required higher security clearances and absolute discretion. What his supervisors did not know was that Eli had been using his expanded access to piece together a puzzle that grew more terrifying with each new fragment of information he uncovered. The file he had been looking for was buried in a section marked HLT 2030, nestled between routine geological surveys and budget projections for monitoring equipment. Hazard Level Threshold 2030. The designation meant nothing to most people, but Eli had learned to recognize the bureaucratic camouflage used to hide the most sensitive documents. He opened the file with trembling fingers. The first page was a summary that made his vision blur. Probabilistic eruption window 2028 to 2032. Confidence interval 94.7%. Recommended public disclosure timeline none. Eli had to read the last line 3 times before its meaning sank in. They had narrowed down the eruption timeline to a 4-year window with near certainty, and the official recommendation was to tell the public nothing. The next section detailed evacuation protocols that divided the American population into 2 distinct categories. Tier 1 included federal government personnel, military leadership, critical infrastructure managers, and selected scientific and medical professionals, approximately 2.3 million people who would receive advanced warning and priority evacuation to designated safe zones. Tier 2 encompassed everyone else, 327 million Americans whose evacuation status was listed with brutal honesty as no viable plan. Eli scrolled through page after page of logistical nightmares and resource calculations. The ash fallout zone would render most of the continental United States uninhabitable for years. The immediate kill zone, a radius of approximately 700 miles from the eruption site, would experience pyroclastic flows, toxic gas emissions, and complete ecological collapse. Even with advanced warning, there were not enough resources to evacuate more than a fraction of the affected population. But the most damning section came toward the end, cross-referenced construction projects that had been authorized and funded over the past decade. Underground facilities in Colorado, Utah, and South Dakota, officially described as continuity of government installations or strategic resource storage sites. The locations formed a clear pattern, far enough from Yellowstone to avoid the immediate devastation, supplied with independent power and air filtration systems, and sized to accommodate the Tier 1 population for extended periods. None of the facilities were located in Wyoming or Montana, the states that would bear the brunt of the initial eruption. The people living in those areas, including Eli himself, were considered acceptable losses. A sound in the corridor outside made Eli freeze. Footsteps were approaching the archive room, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. He quickly photographed the most critical pages with his phone, replaced the file, and pretended to be reviewing mundane seismic reports. The door opened to reveal Deputy Director Webb and a woman Eli did not recognize. Both wore the kind of serious expressions that accompanied discussions of national security. "Grant," Webb nodded, Working late again, I see. Just catching up on some routine analysis, Eli replied. Hopping, his voice sounded steadier than he felt. The woman studied him with interest. You are the intern who has been flagged for unusual database access patterns. I prefer to think of myself as thorough. Webb laughed, but the sound held no humor. Thoroughness is admirable. Discretion is essential. I trust you understand the distinction. After they left, Eli sat alone in the archive room, staring at the photos on his phone. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. A small group of government officials and scientists had known for years that Yellowstone was approaching a catastrophic eruption, and their response had been to save themselves while leaving everyone else to die. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Hundreds of millions of people were going about their daily lives, making plans for the future, raising children and building careers, completely unaware that their government had already written them off as collateral damage in a disaster that could be predicted but not prevented. That night, Eli returned to his apartment in Gardiner, Montana, with a decision crystallizing in his mind. The evidence he had gathered was enough to expose the conspiracy, but he needed more documentation that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. He also needed a way to get the information to journalists who could not be intimidated or bought off. What he did not know was that his activities in the archive had been monitored in real time, and that his phone's camera had triggered security algorithms designed to detect unauthorized photography of classified documents. By the time he fell asleep that night, plans were already being made to ensure that Eli Grant's investigation would end before it could threaten the carefully constructed wall of silence surrounding Yellowstone's deadly secret. Chapter 3, The Suppression, Gardiner, Montana, November the 8th, 2016. Eli's apartment had been turned upside down with surgical precision. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out and dumped, and every electronic device was missing or destroyed. But the most telling detail was what the intruders had not done. They had left his television, his expensive hiking equipment, and the cash he kept in a kitchen drawer. This was not a random burglary. Someone had been looking for specific items, and they had found them. His laptop was gone. His external hard drives were missing. Even his backup thumb drives hidden in a hollowed-out book had been discovered and taken. Months of carefully gathered evidence had vanished in a single night, leaving behind only the photos on his phone. The photos were ones he had been smart enough to upload to a secure cloud storage account before going to bed. Eli stood in his wrecked living room, surveying the damage with a mixture of fear and determination. They had sent a message: stop digging or face consequences. But they had also confirmed that his investigation was getting close to something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. His phone buzzed with a text from Karen. Meet me at Mammoth Terrace's north side. Come alone. 30 minutes later, Eli found Karen standing on the limestone terraces that gave Mammoth Hot Springs its name. Her park ranger uniform stood out stark against the white mineral deposits. Steam rose from the thermal features around them, creating an otherworldly landscape that felt appropriate for the conversation they were about to have. They hit your place, she said without preamble. How did you know? Because they are watching all of us now. Anyone who has asked too many questions, anyone who has shown too much interest in the wrong data. Karen gestured toward the thermal features. You see these springs. They have been active for thousands of years, but their flow patterns have changed dramatically in the past 18 months. The thermal system is destabilizing. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know what you have stumbled into. Karen's expression was grim. I told you I worked on the deep bore project. What I didn't tell you is why I really left. She led him away from the main viewing area, down a maintenance trail that wound behind the limestone formations. The drilling operation was based out of a temporary facility near the Norris Geyser Basin. Officially, we were installing seismic monitoring equipment at a depth that would provide better data about magma chamber activity. But that wasn't the real purpose. The real purpose was to tap into the magma chamber and create controlled release valves. The theory was sound. If you could bleed off pressure gradually, you might prevent a catastrophic eruption, or at least delay it long enough to develop better evacuation procedures. They emerged onto a small plateau that offered a clear view of the valley below. In the distance, Eli could see the geometric lines of roads and buildings that marked human presence in the wilderness, looking tiny and fragile against the vast landscape. What went wrong? Everything. The magma chamber is far more complex than the models predicted. Instead of bleeding off pressure, the venting systems created new pathways for thermal activity. The timeline for eruption may have been accelerated rather than delayed. Karen pulled a small device from her pocket, an encrypted satellite phone that Eli recognized as military hardware. Tom Rodriguez was the lead contractor on the drilling team. He was a geothermal engineer with 23 years of experience and 3 kids. He started asking questions about why the pressure readings weren't matching the theoretical models. What happened to him? A vehicle accident on a mountain road. He lost control on a curve and went over a cliff. It was described as very tragic and very convenient. Karen's jaw tightened. Except Tom was one of the most careful drivers I had ever met, and he had driven that road hundreds of times. Also, his personal notes about the pressure anomalies disappeared from his trailer the same night he died. The implication was clear and terrifying. Eli was looking at a conspiracy that had already used extreme measures to protect its secrets. His ransacked apartment wasn't just a warning. It was a preview of what could happen if he continued to threaten their operational security. Why haven't you gone public with this? With what? A story about a secret government project with no documentation, a convenient accident with no witnesses, and seismic data that gets scrubbed from official records. Karen shook her head. They have been very careful to keep everything compartmentalized. Most of the people involved only know pieces of the puzzle, but together we know enough to expose them. Together we know enough to be put in serious danger. Karen handed him the satellite phone. This is encrypted and routes through military satellites. They can't monitor it easily. If something happens to me, use it to contact investigative journalists. The access codes are programmed in. As they walked back toward the main trail, Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was now part of a resistance movement he had never asked to join, fighting against a conspiracy that possessed resources and ruthlessness he could barely comprehend. That night, he uploaded everything he had learned to multiple secure cloud accounts, created encrypted copies of all his evidence, and began drafting detailed summaries that could be understood by journalists without scientific backgrounds. If something happened to him, the truth would still survive. What he didn't know was that Karen Holt had already been marked for monitoring, and that his own name had moved to the top of a very short list of people deemed problematic for operational security. The conspiracy had spent years perfecting the art of handling situations without raising suspicions. Eli Grant was about to discover just how efficient they had become. In Chapter 4, The False Flag, Lamar Valley, Yellowstone National Park, June 15, 2017. The video went viral within hours of being uploaded. Shot on a tourist smartphone from the Lamar Valley overlook, it showed something that no park official could easily explain away. Nearly 1,000 bison streaming eastward in a coordinated exodus that looked more like an organized retreat than a seasonal migration. Eli watched the footage for the 12th time, pausing on frames that showed the animals' behavior. Their ears were pinned back, and their movements were urgent and purposeful. These weren't animals wandering to new grazing areas. They were fleeing something that had triggered every survival instinct evolution had given them. The official response came within 6 hours. Park spokeswoman Janet Morrison appeared on CNN to explain that large herbivore migrations were completely normal and that social media was creating panic over natural phenomena that occur regularly in Yellowstone. What Morrison did not mention was that the bison were fleeing from a section of the park that had been closed to public access for the past 3 months. The Norris Back Basin, officially under restoration after minor geothermal changes, was actually experiencing subsurface temperatures that had increased by nearly 40 degrees C in the past year. Eli had seen the classified reports. New fumaroles were opening weekly. The ground temperature was rising so rapidly that park maintenance crews could not approach the monitoring equipment without protective suits. Most telling of all, the area was showing magnetic anomalies consistent with massive metallic intrusions, exactly what you would expect if the magma chamber was rising toward the surface. His phone buzzed with a message from Karen, "Need to show you something tonight. Usual place." They met after midnight at the Mammoth Terraces, their breath visible in the cold mountain air. Karen looked haggard, her face showing the strain of months spent living with dangerous knowledge. "I've been monitoring radio traffic from the restricted zones," she said without preamble. "FEMA has been conducting something called Operation Continuity. These are not training exercises. It is an actual deployment." "Deployment of what?" "Command and control infrastructure. They've been installing communication arrays, power systems, and what sounds like permanent housing facilities." Karen pulled out a topographic map marked with red circles. All of these locations correspond to abandoned Cold War bunkers or natural cave systems. They're building something underground. Eli studied the map. The marked locations formed a rough circle around the Yellowstone caldera, each one positioned outside the immediate blast zone, but close enough to maintain operational oversight of the area. How many people could these facilities support? Based on the supply manifests I've been able to intercept, maybe 2,000 people per facility. It is enough for essential government personnel and their families, plus a skeleton crew to maintain basic infrastructure. The scope of the deception was staggering. While telling the public that Yellowstone posed no immediate threat, the government was quietly building underground cities designed to preserve a small fraction of the population through a massive natural disaster. I want to see one of these facilities. Karen shook her head. Too dangerous. They've got military-grade security at all the sites now. Then how do we prove any of this exists? We don't, not directly. Karen handed him a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit, but we can document the construction activity. This is a ground-penetrating radar unit modified to detect large underground structures. If we can map the facilities from the surface, we can prove they exist without having to penetrate their security. 2 nights later, they drove to a remote area near the Shoshone National Forest, following Forest Service roads that weren't marked on any public maps. The official designation was a wildlife research station, but the facilities visible from the access road looked more like a military installation than a scientific outpost. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire surrounded the compound. Guard towers equipped with searchlights and what appeared to be automated tracking systems monitored the perimeter. Most telling of all, massive air conditioning units and ventilation systems indicated that whatever was happening here required significant life support infrastructure. Karen set up the ground-penetrating radar while Eli photographed everything he could see from their concealed position. The radar readings revealed the truth. Beneath the modest surface facilities lay a complex that extended at least 5 levels underground, with enough space to house thousands of people for extended periods. "My God," Eli whispered as he studied the readouts. "It's like an underground city." "One of at least 6 that we know of," Karen replied. "And this is just what they're building in Wyoming and Montana. Intelligence suggests similar facilities are under construction throughout the western United States." As they packed up their equipment, Eli felt a mixture of vindication and terror. They now had proof that the government was secretly preparing for a Yellowstone eruption while publicly denying any threat existed. But they also had evidence of a conspiracy so vast and well-funded that challenging it openly felt incredibly daunting. The drive back to Gardiner was tense and quiet. Both of them understood that they'd crossed a line tonight, moving from passive observation to active intelligence gathering. The people behind the conspiracy would not tolerate this kind of direct surveillance for long. Karen was right to be worried. Unknown to either of them, their activities had been monitored by satellite surveillance systems designed to detect unauthorized reconnaissance. Facial recognition software had identified them both, and their vehicle's license plate had been flagged in regional databases. Within hours, orders would be issued for their immediate apprehension. The conspiracy had decided that Karen Holt and Eli Grant had become too dangerous to remain free. But first, they had to be isolated from any support networks or escape routes. The plan that had been set in motion would ensure that when they disappeared, no one would think to look for them until it was far too late to matter. At Chapter 5, The Smoking Gun, Secure Conference Room, Undisclosed Location, August 3, 2017. The recording device was smaller than a matchbox, designed to look like a routine equipment monitoring sensor of the type found throughout government facilities. Eli had placed it in the ventilation system of conference room C7 3 hours earlier, using his maintenance access codes to enter the secure wing of the Denver Federal Building. What he captured on that device would become the smoking gun that proved everything he'd suspected about the Yellowstone conspiracy. The voices on the recording were clearly identifiable. Deputy Director Webb from FEMA, Assistant Secretary of the Interior Patricia Vance, and at least 2 other officials whose identities Eli couldn't immediately determine. The conversation was conducted with the casual tone of people who believed they were speaking in complete privacy. The latest projections show we're ahead of schedule. Webb's voice came through clearly. Thermal expansion in the Norris sector is accelerating faster than the models predicted. How much faster? Vance asked. 18 to 24 months ahead of the original timeline. We may be looking at a 2029 event rather than 2031. The sound of papers shuffling was audible before another voice joined the conversation. The infrastructure projects are proceeding on schedule, but we'll need to accelerate the relocation of essential personnel if the timeline has moved up. What about public disclosure? Vance asked. Webb's laugh was bitter. Public disclosure remains a non-option. We've run every scenario through the simulation models. Even with a full year of advanced warning, we couldn't evacuate more than 15% of the affected population. The interstate system would collapse within hours. Supply chains would break down completely, and we'd face massive social unrest that would interfere with Tier 1 evacuation procedures. So we maintain the current posture. We maintain the lie, Vance corrected. Continue the public briefings about normal seismic activity, Webb said. Continue dismissing online speculation as conspiracy theories. And most importantly, continue the media relationships that keep investigative journalists focused on other stories. Eli's hands trembled as he listened to the casual discussion of leaving hundreds of millions of people to face the disaster unprepared. These weren't characters in a movie. They were mid-level government bureaucrats who had decided that preserving their own lives and positions was their top priority. The recording continued with logistical discussions that were even more damning. Supply caches were being positioned at the underground facilities. Communication networks that would remain operational during and after the eruption were being tested. Even arrangements for maintaining essential services in the post-eruption population were being planned with clinical efficiency. What about the monitoring station personnel? An unidentified voice asked. Some of them are asking uncomfortable questions. We're handling that, Webb replied. Enhanced security protocols, selective information sharing, and when necessary, personnel reassignments to less sensitive positions. What about the ones who have already seen too much? Problem solved. Webb's voice carried a note of finality that made Eli's stomach turn. The park ranger who was asking questions about the deep bore project will be transferred to a remote station in Alaska next week. A routine reassignment that gets her away from Yellowstone and limits her access to sensitive information. Karen, they were talking about Karen, and Eli knew with sickening certainty that her reassignment would be permanent in ways that had nothing to do with Park Service bureaucracy. The meeting concluded with assignments and timelines that painted a clear picture of a conspiracy in its final phases. The underground facilities would be fully operational by 2028. Essential personnel would begin training exercises that were actually disguised evacuations by early 2029, and the public would remain completely unaware until the eruption made further secrecy impossible. Eli retrieved the recording device later that night, his heart pounding as he navigated the empty corridors of the federal building. The evidence he now possessed was explosive enough to bring down the entire conspiracy if he could find a way to get it to journalists who couldn't be Chinese letter conveyed or discredited. But first, he had to warn Karen about her impending reassignment. He tried calling her cell phone, but got no answer. Her ranger station reported that she was off duty and couldn't be reached for routine inquiries. Growing increasingly worried, Eli drove to her apartment in Mammoth Hot Springs only to find it dark and apparently empty. Karen's supervisor, when Eli finally tracked him down, was apologetic but unhelpful. Officer Halt has been temporarily assigned to a special project in Alaska. She left this morning on a charter flight. Very sudden, but you know how it is with Park Service priorities. Eli knew exactly how it was. Karen Halt had become a liability, and liabilities were being eliminated with bureaucratic efficiency. Her disappearance was a warning and a preview of his own fate if he continued to threaten the conspiracy's operational security. That night, he uploaded the recording to multiple secure servers and began reaching out to investigative journalists whose work suggested they couldn't be easily intimidated. The evidence was now beyond their ability to suppress completely, but Eli understood that possessing it had made him a prime target. He was no longer just a witness to the conspiracy. He was the only person outside their organization who could prove it existed, and that made him a target that couldn't be allowed to remain free. In Chapter 6, The Countdown, Gardiner, Montana, November 12, 2017. The email from ProPublica journalist Michael Chen arrived at 3:47 a.m. marked with encryption protocols that indicated he'd taken Eli's warnings about government surveillance seriously. The message was brief but electrifying, audio verified by 3 independent sources. Document analysis confirms authenticity, ready to publish. Needs secure meeting to discuss protection protocols. Eli had been living as a fugitive in his own life for 3 months, changing locations nightly and communicating only through encrypted channels. The strain was showing. He'd lost 20 pounds, developed chronic insomnia, and started checking his rearview mirror obsessively whenever he drove. But Chen's message confirmed that the months of careful evidence gathering had finally produced results that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. What Eli didn't know was that his encrypted communications had been compromised for weeks, and that every message he'd sent to journalists was being monitored by the same people he was trying to expose. The conspiracy's response was swift and multi-pronged. Within hours of Chen's message, every major news network received exclusive briefings from USGS officials debunking dangerous misinformation about Yellowstone. The briefings included carefully edited seismic data, testimonials from concerned scientists about the psychological damage caused by eruption rumors, and veiled warnings about the national security implications of spreading geological panic. Chen's editor killed the story before it could be published. The official reason was insufficient corroboration from government sources. The The real reason became clear when Chen contacted Eli through secure channels. ProPublica's major donors had received calls from federal officials suggesting that publishing unverified geological speculation could affect the organization's nonprofit status. But the conspiracy had underestimated the modern information landscape. Eli's evidence had been distributed to dozens of journalists, bloggers, and citizen researchers. While mainstream media outlets could be pressured into silence, the decentralized nature of online publishing made complete suppression impossible. On November the 15th, the story broke simultaneously across 17 different platforms. Independent journalists published the recordings. Geology professors confirmed the technical details. Former government employees provided additional context about the classified facilities. Within 48 hours, the Yellowstone conspiracy hashtag was trending globally. The government's response was predictable and desperate. Official spokespeople dismissed the evidence as sophisticated disinformation designed to undermine public confidence in scientific institutions. The recordings were declared fabricated using advanced audio manipulation technology. Alternative explanations were provided for every piece of evidence Eli had gathered, but the dam had broken. Whistleblowers within the system began coming forward with additional documentation. Satellite images of the underground facilities appeared online. Construction workers who had built the secret bunkers shared their stories. Karen Halt, who'd been held at a debriefing facility in Alaska, was released and immediately went public with her testimony about the deep bore project. The revelation that the government had been planning to abandon 300 million Americans while saving only a privileged few sparked the largest protests in American history. Demonstrations erupted in every major city. Congressional hearings were demanded. International allies expressed outrage at being kept in the dark about a disaster that would affect global climate and agriculture. Most importantly, real evacuation planning finally began. With the truth exposed, it became impossible to maintain the fiction that Yellowstone posed no threat. Scientists worked around the clock to develop actual emergency response procedures. International cooperation emerged as other countries offered to assist with evacuation and resettlement efforts. Chapter 7, The Final Message, Yellowstone National Park, January 20th, 2029. Eli stood on the Lamar Valley overlook, watching steam rise from thermal features that had doubled in intensity over the past 18 months. The park was nearly empty now. Evacuations had begun 6 months earlier when seismic activity had become impossible to hide. The animals had fled long ago, following instincts older than human civilization. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the Global Yellowstone Monitoring Consortium, an international scientific collaboration that had formed after the conspiracy's exposure. Seismic precursors accelerating. Event window now estimated at 72 to 96 hours. Final evacuation protocols activated. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same evidence that the conspiracy had tried to suppress for decades was now being used to save millions of lives. The underground facilities that had been built for a privileged few were being converted into evacuation centers for ordinary families. The communication networks designed to preserve government continuity were now coordinating the largest humanitarian operation in human history. Not everyone could be saved. The logistics were still overwhelming, but transparency had enabled genuine preparation instead of elite preservation. International agreements had been signed to relocate climate refugees. Agricultural systems had been modified to function with altered growing conditions. Supply chains had been restructured to survive massive disruption. Eli's satellite phone rang. Karen's voice came through clearly from her position at the Evacuation Coordination Center in Denver. Final transport leaves Gardner in 30 minutes, she reported. You need to be on it. I'll be there, Eli replied. But he remained standing on the overlook for several more minutes. Below him, Yellowstone spread out in its terrible beauty, a landscape that had remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, about to be transformed by forces that made human concerns seem trivial. His phone's camera was still recording as he delivered his final message. This is Eli Grant reporting from Yellowstone National Park on January 20th, 2029. In approximately 3 days, this place will become ground zero for the largest volcanic eruption in human history. But unlike the conspiracy originally planned, this won't be a secret apocalypse that kills hundreds of millions while saving a few thousand elites. Because the truth came out, we've had time to prepare. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. The people fleeing this region know what's coming and why. The international community is ready to help. The aftermath will be terrible, but it won't be hidden, and it won't be used to justify abandoning the principles of democratic society. If you're watching this from the future, remember that transparency saved lives. Remember that ordinary people, when given truth instead of lies, are capable of extraordinary cooperation. And remember that the greatest disasters are always made worse by the people who try to profit from them instead of preventing them. As he walked back to his truck for the final drive to the evacuation point, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. It was not for avoiding the catastrophe that was beyond human power to prevent, but hope that when the crisis came, humanity would face it together rather than divided by the lies of those who valued their own survival above everyone else's. Epilogue: The Quiet After the Storm. New Geneva, International Reconstruction Zone, January 20th, 2034. 5 years after the Yellowstone eruption, Eli Grant stood before the International Truth and Reconciliation Commission, delivering testimony that would help ensure such a conspiracy could never again threaten global security. The hearing was being broadcast live to millions of survivors in refugee communities across 6 continents. The eruption had been as devastating as predicted. Ash fallout had disrupted global agriculture for 3 years. Climate patterns had shifted dramatically, and large areas of North America remained uninhabitable. But because the truth had emerged in time, the disaster had brought out humanity's cooperative instincts rather than its destructive ones. The Yellowstone conspiracy taught us that the greatest threats to human survival aren't natural disasters. Eli concluded his testimony. They're the institutions that respond to those disasters by protecting themselves at the expense of everyone else. Transparency isn't just an ideal, it's a survival strategy. In the audience, Karen Holt nodded her approval. She now directed the Global Early Warning Network, an international organization dedicated to ensuring that geological threats could never again be hidden from the public. Around the world, the underground facilities originally built for elite preservation had been converted into research stations, museums, and memorials dedicated to democratic accountability. The Yellowstone conspiracy had been exposed just in time to save millions of lives, but more importantly, it had revealed the difference between a society that prepares for disaster together and one that allows the powerful to abandon everyone else when crisis strikes. As Eli walked out of the hearing room into the rebuilt world beyond, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones we tell ourselves we're keeping for everyone's own good. The truth, no matter how terrifying, is always preferable to a lie that serves only the few at the expense of the many. The Pressure Files: What Really Happened to the Ocean Gate Submersible. On June 18, 2023, 5 people descended toward the wreck of the Titanic in a submersible called Titan. None of them would return alive. The world was told it was a tragic accident, a catastrophic implosion caused by structural failure. But what if the official story is incomplete? What if there's evidence that something else happened down there in the crushing darkness, something that powerful institutions have worked very hard to keep quiet? Tonight, we're going to examine the data they never released, the messages that disappeared, and the acoustic anomalies that don't match the narrative you've been told. This is the story of the Pressure Files and what really happened to the Ocean Gate Submersible. Part 1: The File That Started Everything. June 26, 2023, 2 days after the Titan submersible was officially declared lost with all hands, a maritime analyst named Elias North received an email that would change everything. Elias wasn't a household name, but in the tight-knit world of deep-sea exploration and maritime safety analysis, he was respected. He had spent 15 years working with various ocean research institutions, analyzing dive data, and consulting on submersible safety protocols. The email came from an anonymous address, a randomly generated string of letters and numbers that would later prove impossible to trace. There was no message in the body of the email, just a single attachment. The file was named exactly this: Titan Log Pressure Anomalies 0519-0618. XLSX. Elias almost deleted it. Anonymous files from unknown sources were usually spam or worse. Yet, something about the specificity of that file name made him pause. The dates caught his attention immediately, May 19th through June 18th. That ending date was the day Titan went down. He opened the file. What he found inside was extraordinary. There were dozens upon dozens of entries, technical readings that appeared to be genuine ocean gate internal logs, pressure readings, acoustic measurements, hull stress calculations, and things that should never have left the company's secure servers. Each entry was time-stamped, geotagged with coordinates, and included detailed technical annotations. Elias spent the first hour simply verifying what he could. The formatting matched Ocean Gate's known data structure. The technical terminology was correct. The coordinate readings aligned with known Titan dive locations from previous expeditions. Everything about the file indicated authenticity. But it was one specific entry that made his hands shake as he scrolled through the spreadsheet. June 18th, 08:54, Coordinated Universal Time, exactly the morning of the implosion, just minutes before Titan went silent. The entry read, Extremely Rapid Compression, Source Unknown, External Origin. External Origin. Not a hull failure, not an internal structural collapse, but something from outside the submersible. Elias read the line again. Then he started going through every other entry in the file, and what he discovered was even more disturbing. The pressure anomalies didn't start on June 18th. They went back weeks. There were irregular readings on multiple previous dives, entries that suggested Titan had been experiencing unexplained external pressure events long before its final journey. This contradicted everything the public had been told. The narrative was simple, almost reassuring in its clarity. Titan was an experimental submersible that had pushed its materials beyond safe limits. The hull failed, the occupants died instantly, making it tragic but explainable, a cautionary tale about innovation outpacing safety. But if this file was real, that story was incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. The same evidence that the conspiracy had tried to suppress for decades was now being used to save millions of lives. The underground facilities that had been built for a privileged few were being converted into evacuation centers for ordinary families. The communication networks designed to preserve government continuity were now coordinating the largest humanitarian operation in human history. Not everyone could be saved. The logistics were still overwhelming, but transparency had enabled genuine preparation instead of elite preservation. International agreements had been signed to relocate climate refugees. Agricultural systems had been modified to function with altered growing conditions. Supply chains had been restructured to survive massive disruption. Eli's satellite phone rang. Karen's voice came through clearly from her position at the Evacuation Coordination Center in Denver. Final transport leaves Gardner in 30 minutes, she reported. You need to be on it. I'll be there, Eli replied. But he remained standing on the overlook for several more minutes. Below him, Yellowstone spread out in its terrible beauty, a landscape that had remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, about to be transformed by forces that made human concern seem trivial. His phone's camera was still recording as he delivered his final message. This is Eli Grant reporting from Yellowstone National Park on January 20th, 2029. In approximately 3 days, this place will become ground zero for the largest volcanic eruption in human history. But unlike the conspiracy originally planned, this won't be a secret apocalypse that kills hundreds of millions while saving a few thousand elites. Because the truth came out, we've had time to prepare. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. The people fleeing this region know what's coming and why. The international community is ready to help. The aftermath will be terrible, but it won't be hidden, and it won't be used to justify abandoning the principles of democratic society. If you're watching this from the future, remember that transparency saved lives. Remember that ordinary people, when given truth instead of lies, are capable of extraordinary cooperation. And remember that the greatest disasters are always made worse by the people who try to profit from them instead of preventing them. As he walked back to his truck for the final drive to the evacuation point, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. It was not for avoiding the catastrophe that was beyond human power to prevent, but hope that when the crisis came, humanity would face it together rather than divided by the lies of those who valued their own survival above everyone else's. Epilogue: The quiet after the storm. New Geneva, International Reconstruction Zone, January 20th, 2034. 5 years after the Yellowstone eruption, Eli Grant stood before the International Truth and Reconciliation Commission, delivering testimony that would help ensure such a conspiracy could never again threaten global security. The hearing was being broadcast live to millions of survivors in refugee communities across 6 continents. The eruption had been as devastating as predicted. Ash fallout had disrupted global agriculture for 3 years. Climate patterns had shifted dramatically, and large areas of North America remained uninhabitable. But because the truth had emerged in time, the disaster had brought out humanity's cooperative instincts rather than its destructive ones. The Yellowstone conspiracy taught us that the greatest threats to human survival aren't natural disasters. Eli concluded his testimony. They're the institutions that respond to those disasters by protecting themselves at the expense of everyone else. Transparency isn't just an ideal, it's a survival strategy. In the audience, Karen Holt nodded her approval. She now directed the Global Early Warning Network, an international organization dedicated to ensuring that geological threats could never again be hidden from the public. Around the world, the underground facilities originally built for elite preservation had been converted into research stations, museums, and memorials dedicated to democratic accountability. The Yellowstone conspiracy had been exposed just in time to save millions of lives, but more importantly, it had revealed the difference between a society that prepares for disaster together and one that allows the powerful to abandon everyone else when crisis strikes. As Eli walked out of the hearing room into the rebuilt world beyond, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones we tell ourselves we're keeping for everyone's own good. The truth, no matter how terrifying, is always preferable to a lie that serves only the few at the expense of the many. The Pressure Files: What Really Happened to the Ocean Gate Submersible. On June 18, 2023, 5 people descended toward the wreck of the Titanic in a submersible called Titan. None of them would return alive. The world was told it was a tragic accident, a catastrophic implosion caused by structural failure. But what if the official story is incomplete? What if there's evidence that something else happened down there in the crushing darkness, something that powerful institutions have worked very hard to keep quiet? Tonight, we're going to examine the data they never released, the messages that disappeared, and the acoustic anomalies that don't match the narrative you've been told. This is the story of the Pressure Files and what really happened to the Ocean Gate Submersible. Part 1: The File That Started Everything. June 26, 2023, 2 days after the Titan submersible was officially declared lost with all hands, a maritime analyst named Elias North received an email that would change everything. Elias wasn't a household name, but in the tight-knit world of deep-sea exploration and maritime safety analysis, he was respected. He had spent 15 years working with various ocean research institutions, analyzing dive data, and consulting on submersible safety protocols. The email came from an anonymous address, a randomly generated string of letters and numbers that would later prove impossible to trace. There was no message in the body of the email, just a single attachment. The file was named exactly this: Titan Log Pressure Anomalies 0519-0618, XLSX. Elias almost deleted it. Anonymous files from unknown sources were usually spam or worse. Yet, something about the specificity of that file name made him pause. The dates caught his attention immediately, May 19th through June 18th. That ending date was the day Titan went down. He opened the file. What he found inside was extraordinary. There were dozens upon dozens of entries, technical readings that appeared to be genuine ocean gate internal logs, pressure readings, acoustic measurements, hull stress calculations, and things that should never have left the company's secure servers. Each entry was time-stamped, geotagged with coordinates, and included detailed technical annotations. Elias spent the first hour simply verifying what he could. The formatting matched Ocean Gate's known data structure. The technical terminology was correct. The coordinate readings aligned with known Titan dive locations from previous expeditions. Everything about the file indicated authenticity. But it was one specific entry that made his hands shake as he scrolled through the spreadsheet. June 18th, 08:54, Coordinated Universal Time, exactly the morning of the implosion, just minutes before Titan went silent. The entry read, extremely rapid compression, source unknown, external origin. External origin. Not a hull failure, not an internal structural collapse, but something from outside the submersible. Elias read the line again. Then he started going through every other entry in the file, and what he discovered was even more disturbing. The pressure anomalies didn't start on June 18th. They went back weeks. There were irregular readings on multiple previous dives, entries that suggested Titan had been experiencing unexplained external pressure events long before its final journey. This contradicted everything the public had been told. The narrative was simple, almost reassuring in its clarity. Titan was an experimental submersible that had pushed its materials beyond safe limits. The hull failed, the occupants died instantly, making it tragic but explainable, a cautionary tale about innovation outpacing safety. But if this file was real, that story was incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. Elias stored 3 separate copies of the document across different protected digital storage folders. This marked the beginning of the most critical review of his career. He had no clue that in just a few weeks, he would become a major focus for the deep-sea research community while trying to remain entirely hidden. He was also completely unaware that powerful groups already knew exactly what information had been sent to his inbox. Part 2. The True Timeline. Before exploring Elias' discoveries further, it helps to review the established facts and undisputed occurrences that everyone agrees on. The core mystery does not rely on making up a fake story. It lives in the quiet spaces between official statements and the unanswered questions that remain. Ocean Gate Expeditions was started in 2009 by Stockton Rush and his partners. The firm intended to make deep ocean travel far more attainable, designing underwater vessels capable of taking paying passengers and scientific researchers down to depths that used to require heavy military or state-funded gear. It was a major, highly ambitious plan. The vessel itself, named Titan, featured a highly non-traditional design. Instead of using a classic heavy titanium metal sphere for the cabin, this craft utilized a blend of carbon fiber and titanium pieces. While this made the vehicle much lighter and capable of dropping down and rising back up quickly, carbon fiber reacts quite differently to extreme pressure shifts than solid metal. It does not weaken in a slow, predictable way. Instead, when it fails, it breaks completely and instantly. The vessel began running trips down to the Titanic site in 2021. The famous ship rests roughly 3,800 meters below the ocean surface, which is about 2.5 miles down. At that specific depth, the surrounding water pressure is nearly 375 times greater than the pressure at sea level, placing thousands of pounds of crushing force onto every single square inch of the hull. The specific trip that ended in disaster began on June 18, 2023. 5 individuals were on board. Stockton Rush, the company head and pilot. Hamish Harding, a British businessman and explorer. Shahzada Dawood and his 19-year-old son, Suleiman Dawood, from a prominent Pakistani business family. Paul Henry Nargialet, a highly experienced French ocean explorer who had navigated to the Titanic wreck site more than 30 separate times. The vessel lost all communication with its main support ship, the Polar Prince, exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes into its downward trip. The very last message sent was a standard status update, followed by total silence. A massive international search effort began immediately, with aircraft and ships rushing to the location. People around the globe watched the updates. Hopping the vessel was sitting safely on the ocean floor with its passengers alive, but unable to transmit a signal. However, on June 22nd, a field of debris was located very close to the Titanic wreck. The scattered pieces left no doubt that a sudden, massive hull collapse had occurred. The crushing weight of the water would have destroyed the cabin instantly, meaning the passengers would have lost their lives far quicker than the human body can register pain. Shortly after, a major detail emerged that made Elias' leaked files incredibly significant. On June 28th, the United States Navy confirmed that their specialized underwater listening systems had picked up an unusual sound signature at the exact moment the vessel went silent. The military had actually heard the structural collapse happen in real time and knew right away that the craft was lost, but they kept the data quiet at first to avoid revealing the sensitive capabilities of their tracking network. That specific audio recording would become a core piece of Elias' research. Part 3. What the logs revealed. Instead of immediately publishing the leaked document, Elias spent the next week trying to prove it was a fake. He looked for any sign of a hoax, contacting former contractors with subtle questions that did not reveal the files he held. He also checked the data against public records regarding the vessel's engineering specifications. Everything lined up perfectly. Even worse, the spreadsheet contained highly specific internal details that had never been shared with the public, such as precise part numbers for the tracking tools and internal software codes. This proved the information had to come directly from internal company computers. The recorded data showed that the vessel had run into unusual external pressure shifts on at least 6 different days during the 3 weeks leading up to its final trip. These were not the standard, smooth pressure increases that occur naturally as a craft sinks lower. These were sharp, sudden spikes where the pressure on the exterior wall jumped violently for a brief moment before returning to normal. For example, on June 3rd, during a trip that was publicly labeled a success, the log recorded a major pressure spike at 2,000 meters down, noting an unidentified external impact with no visible damage found. On June 9th, another spike happened at 3,000 meters, causing the wall sensors to register extreme stress numbers that should have triggered immediate warnings, though operations continued. The most alarming note occurred on June 14th, just 4 days before the fatal accident. At 3,500 meters down, the logs showed the vessel experienced a sudden side compression event. This was not the expected, evenly distributed pressure from all sides. It was a sharp force striking from the flank. The note attached to that entry was terrifying. A tiny structural crack was detected in the rear section, causing the team to stop the dive and return to the surface. However, because the crack could not be confirmed by a simple visual check, the vehicle was cleared to dive again. The crew knew the structure was under immense stress and had registered internal damage, but because they could not see the microscopic fractures with the naked eye, they kept running operations anyway. Elias began sharing these specific data points with structural engineers, metal experts, and acoustic scientists, presenting the numbers as a pretend scenario to find out what could cause sudden side pressure spikes at those depths. The explanations he received were deeply unsettling. Multiple experts gave Elias the same explanation. At those extreme ocean depths, sudden pressure anomalies simply do not occur naturally. Deep-sea water pressure is immense, but it is always constant and highly predictable. It does not spike or strike from sharp angles unless something else is physically present down there. The data suggested a massive object moving rapidly past the submersible. However, very few known vessels can move at high speeds nearly 4,000 meters down. Ocean currents or underwater landslides were ruled out because the geology around the Titanic wreck does not support those events. This left only highly unsettling options: an unlisted military craft, an unknown geological event, or an unexplained presence. Part 4. The Missing Messages. While the public was told that Titan's final message was a standard, routine status update, Elias' file revealed a completely different timeline. The internal logs listed 6 additional messages sent from the submersible on June 18th between 08:30 and 08:52 UTC, just moments before the implosion. The full text was missing, but the technical notes describing the transmissions revealed a progressive emergency. 08:32, the crew reported visual distortions outside the viewport, describing them as shimmering and asking the surface to confirm if this was normal. 08:37, the logs noted acoustic anomalies, specifically loud metallic impacts that did not match standard hull stress or engine sounds. 08:41, Titan requested a surface sonar scan, mentioning a potential object directly below their position. 08:45, the crew asked if another submersible was actively operating in the immediate area. 08:50, an urgent request was made to establish direct contact with the expedition coordinator regarding past dive data. 08:53, a final broken transmission was cut off mid-sentence. Is there another? At 08:54, the severe pressure spike occurred. By 08:56, all communication ceased as the vessel imploded. These messages were entirely omitted from every public briefing and official investigation summary. Part 5. Unexplained acoustic data. On June 20th, a Canadian P-3 Poseidon aircraft picked up regular banging noises at 30-minute intervals, raising brief global hopes that the passengers were alive and signaling for help. Officially, these sounds were later dismissed as random ocean noise, marine life, or echoes from nearby surface ships. However, Elias obtained the raw audio files rather than the public summaries. A detailed analysis proved the sounds were far too precise and metronomic to be humans hitting a hull. Spectral testing showed that the frequencies did not match impacts on carbon fiber or titanium. Instead, the audio carried the exact characteristics of high-power, active sonar pings bouncing off a hard surface. Elias reviewed the audio with Marcus Webb, a retired naval acoustic technician with 25 years of experience tracking submarines. Webb confirmed that the pings came from a massive, moving object, but the pulse structure and frequency modulation matched no known military or research vessel in existence. The system operated on entirely unique engineering principles, operating right at the Titanic wreck site for reasons the military kept hidden. Part 6. The Hidden Naval Files. Although the U.S. Navy publicly stated on June 28 that its underwater surveillance system, IUSS, had detected a single implosion signature, Elias secured a redacted document from the Naval Sea Systems Command, NAVSEA, titled Atlantic Command Acoustic Analysis, Event 623 Echo. The files confirmed that the Navy did not just hear a standard hull collapse. They had tracked multiple highly unusual acoustic signatures, discovering that the structural failure was immediately preceded by a massive, concentrated external energy displacement. The document indicated that something else was in the water with Titan, and the official accident report was intentionally simplified to keep the public from looking into the true nature of what resides in the deep Atlantic trench. The official discovery of Titan's debris occurred on June 23rd. The naval document, while likely using a code designation, revealed extraordinary details that the public never heard. The Navy's specialized listening systems had picked up not one, but two distinct acoustic events separated by just 0.8 of a second. High-fidelity recordings from the IUSS system clearly showed that the first event matched the sharp, powerful pulse of a pressure hull failing at depth. That was the sounds of the Titan's passenger chamber suddenly collapsing under intense weight. However, the second event, occurring slightly less than a second later, carried a completely different frequency profile, duration, and point of origin. While incredibly close to the original collapse, it was distinct. The Navy report offered two possibilities, one of which was redacted. The official recommendation was to further analyze the stage failure theory, or the possibility that something else impacted the area at the exact moment of the collapse. Elias found no evidence that further analysis was ever done, raising staggering questions about what created the second sound and whether it was a coincidence or a cause. Part 7. The Warnings Ignored. As Elias investigated OceanGate's background, he discovered that Titan's problems extended much further back than publicly known. 4 years before the fatal disaster, in 2019, Titan underwent a test dive near the Titanic wreck site that had to be aborted under highly concerning circumstances. Internal reports Elias discovered detailed that during this dive at 3,500 meters, Titan's monitoring systems picked up unexplained acoustic spikes, and the hull stress sensors registered distortions that defied engineering models. Most alarming was a specific notation about unknown external contact. Something had either struck or touched the submersible. The dive was immediately stopped, and the vehicle returned to the surface. Though engineers could not visually confirm any damage, microscopic stress patterns were later found in the material structure that indicated external focused force. OceanGate officials dismissed the event as a sensor glitch and continued operations. However, a retired engineer anonymously confirmed to Elias that they were told to note the anomaly and move on. Elias now wondered, what if Titan encountered the same entity in 2019 that it would meet fatally in 2023, with the only difference being that they turned back the first time? Part 8. The Corridor Everyone Monitors. Marcus Webb, the retired Navy acoustic technician, provided Elias with information that completely shifted the investigation. He explained that the region around the Titanic wreck is actually one of the most acoustically monitored sections of the ocean in the entire world. Elias was surprised by this, as it is far from strategic military points. However, Webb explained that its extreme isolation and lack of background noise made it perfect for Cold War baseline calibration of acoustic systems. This means the Navy possesses highly detailed knowledge of the sound profile in that specific region and can detect any vessel, submarine, significant biological occurrence, or geological event that passes through the corridor. Nothing moves down there without someone hearing it, Webb told Elias. The core question remained, if the Navy knew exactly what occurred, why did the public receive no information? Webb's dark expression confirmed Elias' fear. Either the military detected something that defies strategic explanation, or they are keeping silent about something they do not wish to discuss publicly. Elias spent days researching the acoustic history of the wreck region, finding decades of footnotes in oceanographic research papers documenting unusual acoustic anomalies, metallic echoes that did not correspond to the wreck, and objects moving faster than known vessels or marine life could navigate at those depths. Every occurrence was officially attributed to equipment malfunction, creating a pattern over 40 years of non-standard observations, receiving standard scientific dismissals. Part 9. Nargiolet's Secret Map. Paul-Henri Nargiolet, the highly experienced French explorer who died aboard Titan, knew the Titanic wreck site better than anyone else alive. After the disaster, while his public contributions were celebrated, Elias became interested in his recent private research. Contacts in the maritime archaeology community revealed that Nargiolet had spent the years leading up to his death on a massive, comprehensive sonar mapping project covering several kilometers around the wreck in every direction. He had reportedly become fascinated by strange geological formations about 2 kilometers east of the Titanic. An oceanographer who collaborated on the project told Elias, on condition of anonymity, that Nargiolet discovered a specific structure that did not match the surrounding geology. Described as possessing very straight, almost geometric edges, Nargiolet designated it Site Z and intended to conduct a proper survey of the anomaly, speculating that it might be a geological formation shaped by ancient currents, yet noting its angles were far too precise for natural occurrence. Elias attempted to obtain Nargiolet's secret maps, but was politely declined by official archives. However, he discovered a high-resolution sonar slide Nargiolet presented at a small 2022 maritime conference. The image displayed a formation that appeared completely angular with straight edges and what looked like right-angle corners. The slide listed the specific location of the geometric anomaly, 1,600 meters east of the Titanic. Part 10. The deviation. Standard procedure for Titan on June 18th should have been a routine, vertical descent direct to the Titanic wreck site. However, when Elias reconstructed the submersible's dive path based on last known communication coordinates, typical current patterns, and OceanGate protocols, he discovered a subtle but major deviation. The submersible had not gone straight down. It appeared to be heading east, directly towards Nargiolet's anomalous geometric structure at Site Z. This deviation was never mentioned in any official briefing or investigation summary. The entire public narrative maintained that Titan was descending directly to the Titanic when it imploded. While this could be an oversight to Elias, it suggested that acknowledgement of the deviation would raise dangerous questions regarding what the crew was looking for and what they might have ultimately found near the undisclosed structure. Part 11. The structure beneath the wreck. Elias needed definitive proof regarding what was physically present on the ocean floor at Site Z. This led him to the archives of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the organization that originally helped locate the Titanic wreck in 1985. After repeatedly submitting Freedom of Information Act requests and waiting for months, Elias finally received sonar files from surveys conducted in the late 1990s. The mapping project clearly documented a large seafloor feature designated as Feature 17B, located roughly 2 kilometers east-northeast of the Titanic. The technical notes and sonar images displayed a distinctly geometric, large triangular structure that rose several meters above the ocean floor. Crucially, the feature showed uniform acoustic reflectivity, meaning it was composed of consistent material, unlike the surrounding chaotic sediment, rock, and debris field. The 1998 survey report recommended further investigation of this unusual geological phenomenon, but as far as Elias could determine, no follow-up was ever publicly released. Elias sent the sonar images to a geological oceanographer for context, carefully withholding the location. The expert confirmed the regular geometry was highly unusual for natural processes. When told the location near the Titanic, the expert was shocked, noting that with all the traffic to the wreck, it was surprising that nobody had investigated such an anomaly in 40 years. Unless, as Elias suspected, someone had investigated it and did not want the public to know what they had discovered. Part 12. The Last Image. Elias' investigation had built a massive circumstantial case suggesting a dangerous external presence at Site Z, but he possessed no direct proof of what the Titan crew had actually seen in their final moments. That changed when he received a second anonymous communication through a highly sophisticated, encrypted service. Check the recovered control systems. File path recovered fragments viewport camera cache June 18. Officially, investigators stated that no usable data had been recovered from the electronic components of the debris field. However, Elias' source suggested otherwise. He spent weeks chasing down forensic specialists, receiving constant denials regarding recoverable data. Then, a small article in a technical journal briefly mentioned forensic specialists on the Titan team had extracted partial image files from a damaged solid-state drive found near the control tablet. The article was quickly retracted, but Elias had saved a copy. Calling in every favor, Elias eventually obtained a single, low-resolution image file. Most of the data was corrupted, but what remained was extraordinary. The image showed the view from Titan's viewport on June 18, 2023 at 08:53 UTC, 1 minute before Titan's last partial message. The image was dark, illuminated only by Titan's external lights, but it showed a smooth, reflective surface that caught the light, suggesting metal. There was a clear, sharp right angle where this surface met another. While large sections of the image were missing data, the remaining fragments unmistakably showed straight lines and deep shadows that spoke of artificial construction, not natural ocean floor. Part 12. The Contact. Elias knew his investigation had crossed a critical line. He had been careful with encryption and compartmentalization, but someone with significant power was paying attention. On an evening in late September, his phone rang from a blocked number. "Mr. North," a professional male voice said, "it is not important who this is. What is important is that you stop investigating the structure." Elias asked, "What structure?" "You know what structure. The formation near the Titanic wreck. The deviation. The case you have been building. Stop." The voice continued calmly. "Titan failed because of structural inadequacies. That has been established. Anything else you are pursuing is a distraction. I am someone trying to help you avoid a significant mistake. Publishing conspiracy theories about secret ocean structures will destroy your good reputation and accomplish nothing." "Are you saying there is no structure?" Elias asked. "I am saying that what is or is not on the ocean floor at that location is irrelevant to the Titan investigation. There are things in the ocean that are best left undisturbed. Walk away from this." Elias asked what would happen if he didn't. The voice replied, "Then you will find that your sources dry up, your reputation suffers, and your investigation leads nowhere. We are not threatening you. We are advising you for your own benefit." The call ended. It had confirmed everything. Elias immediately backed up all his files to multiple secure locations, documented the conversation, and prepared a summary of his findings. 3 days later, he woke to discover his computer's local hard drive corrupted and wiped, his cloud accounts deleted, and his local backup drives remotely formatted. Every file connected to a network was gone, everything except the hidden copies he had stored on old USB drives in a safe deposit box and mailed to himself physically. Whoever warned him had followed through, demonstrating their extreme capabilities while not being quite thorough enough. Part 14. The Final Clue. Elias was terrified, but the remote deletion of his files had given him new energy. It proved he was onto something real. He spent weeks in isolation, paranoid, varying his routines and rebuilding his research from offline backups. Then, in mid-October, he received one more anonymous communication, a physical letter to a PO box under a fake name. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed NOAA header. The message was brief. The ocean floor holds things older than the wreck. They didn't want tourists finding out. Attached was a high-resolution, professional quality photograph taken by a remotely operated vehicle. The image showed a section of ocean sediment and rock. Embedded deep within that rock was a panel, metal, clearly artificial, and roughly 2 meters square. Under the marine growth covering the surface, an edge was just barely visible, a perfect right angle identical to what Elias had seen in the corrupted viewport image from Titan. The metal was embedded so deeply in the rock that it had clearly been there for a very long time, not decades, but possibly centuries. Elias studied the image for hours, now having proof that something old and artificial was indeed at Site Z, something someone was very desperate to keep secret. Part 15, the upload. Elias knew he had to release everything he had uncovered. Keeping the information to himself served no purpose, but releasing it through traditional academic or maritime channels would result in immediate suppression. So he prepared a comprehensive, fully documented report including every source, analysis, and piece of evidence. He encrypted the file and uploaded it simultaneously to multiple secure platforms, links sent to trusted journalists, deep-sea mystery forums, and activists. The last line of his report read, "The Titan didn't fail because of bad engineering alone. It failed because it got too close to something it wasn't supposed to find. Something that's been hidden at the bottom of the Atlantic for longer than anyone wants to admit." The immediate response was overwhelming, and the report began spreading rapidly. But 24 hours after the upload, every link went dead. Every file copy was showing as corrupted or deleted. The forums were suddenly offline for maintenance. Journalists who had contacted Elias stopped responding. The story was systematically erased from the internet by forces with vast resources. Elias attempted to repost from new accounts and different platforms, but each time the files were deleted within hours. 1 week later, Elias received a final message through an encrypted channel he believed was secure. Just 3 words, "Stop now, please." He made one last attempt, agreeing to meet with a documentary filmmaker in person with no electronic footprint. Elias never showed up. His apartment was found empty with no sign of a struggle, and he hasn't been heard from since November 2023. His family filed a missing person report, but police found no evidence of foul play. Bank accounts haven't been accessed, and his phone hasn't been used. He simply vanished. Copies of Elias' report still circulate in the darkest, encrypted corners of the internet where dangerous trade is made. People who have read it understand that somewhere 2.5 miles beneath the surface near the Titanic, Site Z is still there, geometric, anomalous, and waiting. The official story regarding the OceanGate Titan is true as far as engineering failure and corporate recklessness go, but it just does not go nearly far enough. The ocean covers 70% of our planet, and we know more about the surface of Mars than we do about its unexplored depths. In those crushing trenches and absolute darkness, there may be things that institutions have known about for centuries and decided to keep secret, things that maybe, just maybe, we are not supposed to find.